Okay, good evening, everybody. Welcome to another stream. Seems we're quite busy, so hope you're enjoying it with us. Good evening, everybody on Discord.
Hello.
Hey, Nico.
Hello.
Good evening.
Okay, guys, as you can see, we're still loading up. It happened all of a sudden, so just bear with us. We'll get traction soon. I'm also waiting to hear from Twkster. He is in the room here with us, but he's muted his mic, so I presume he might be on a phone call or something. And I invited him to come and join us because he created the new flight model and also this new neutral shift FCC controller thing. So I want him to just explain it to us here. And I mean, he's the best guy for the job, right? So yeah, that'll be nice to hear that. Hi Rob en hallo Geert, goeienaand. All right, I'm not in a great rush. I'll rather do things properly than rush everything. So just bear with me. Come on, go, stay there. Amen. Silly Billy.
Hello Cap.
Hello Linda.
Nice to see you again. Don't forget to start the A cars.
I just did that. Thank you very much.
I am ready for electrical power up procedure.
Okay, Twkster says he's busy trying to set up the mic on his desktop. So we'll slowly start on this side, Twkster, but you join us when you're ready. What did I want to check now? Documents. But there we go. Okay. You just see that everything comes up on the stream here. That's it. Okay, guys on Discord, you can see the OFP, right?
Yes.
Hi, Mac.
Hello.
Right, okay. Good, guys. So let me see if my update worked, if I'm on J now, because that will be a bummer if we do everything and then we're not. All right, so let me also quickly do this. Where is my stream? I hope there's enough room to put this in here. Otherwise, we'll split it or something. Oh, no, that's right. Okay, so there's the change log, and I'm going to pin it to the top. All right, so you can see there that Zibo's fixed bugs with this Autoflight handling thing. Twkster has updated the new flight model, which he gave first a day ago. And then there's a new feature called neutral shift. All right, if you click on show more below the video, you can read the show notes. I've put a brief description of it in there, but then we decided we're going to ask Twkster to come and chat with us. So if he can get his mic going. Hold a second. Twkster, when you look at my stream in Discord, you won't hear any sound coming from the aircraft as such because I'm sharing my screen and not the application. If you're looking on YouTube, then there must be sound. There must definitely be sound. Which one are you looking at? Let me quickly share the application. Hold on. Sorry, guys. So just join my stream again. You should hear the sound of the ambience. The aircraft's not running, so you should hear something now. Okay, can you hear us talk at least, Twkster? Can you hear our voices? He's disconnected. Yeah, he's having connectivity issues, shame, man. Okay, I hope he can make it. I hope he can come back. Because it would be nice to just hear from himself, you know, after all he made it. So it would be cool to hear what he says. Okay, while we wait, let us continue. Let's quickly check outside. Okay, we are not at the jetway, so this will be the first time we're streaming where we are not at the jetway. I've got Yeri's new ground services in here. It's a little bit upgraded since you saw it the last time, and this time it looks like it's stable. It doesn't come and go with the wind. Hello, James, welcome. Right, so let's get going. We know what to do, I suppose. Right, so let's again check everything. Okay, guys on Discord, you're not going to see this now because I'm streaming the app, not the screen, but the guys on YouTube will see it. Sorry about that, but we need to do what we need to do. So we've got 126, that is true. We've got 2.1, that's true. 5.1 on the fuel is true. 58.3, that's true. So let's activate that. All right, so it needs to remove a bit of fuel according to that. Yeah, I overloaded a bit. Where am I going? Did you guys hear the fuel guy speak? I didn't hear him speak.
No, I didn't as well.
That's strange. Okay, that's bug number one. Right, so while that is loading, let us continue.
Ground to flight deck, fuel is all loaded up and you are good to go.
Now he's spoken. I heard him now. So I wonder if it was because I was outside. Remember, I was outside. It could be that we can't hear him on the outside, which is strange. I don't know. Could be. Hello, Cavalcade Simulations. I was still reading, now you delete your comment. Rob. I was literally still reading it, but anyway, it's fine. I'm not in the explained beta, by the way. This is the stable release. I also didn't feel like flying the beta today. Yeah, James, I don't know what works and what does not work in terms of SAM. I've given up on that add-on, so I just use it what you see. What you see is what you get. FTM for November. Okay, gotcha. All right, I'm going to talk to you more about the update. There's one or two things I want to mention to you, but Twkster is still struggling to get his comms going. I would so love him to get it right, so we'll just give him a few more minutes. Yeah, exactly. I don't really bother with it too much, I must be honest. Right, legs. That's a good guess. I convinced myself to enable the magenta on the go-around, guys. I don't know if you can recall, I mentioned that I don't have the dashed cyan lines. I just went and changed it. I don't like it. I prefer the dashed cyan. This is actually annoying to me, but at least now I can see my line when I go on the go-around. Okay, cargo is loading this time. That's one bug fixed. Bax is also loading. Hey Tommy, welcome.
Nico, I'm confused.
Yeah, got me.
Didn't Lamina mess with the flight model with version 08?
They did.
And you're flying
changed.
07?
Correct. According to Zibo, when I asked him which one he wants me to fly, he said it doesn't matter. Because I don't know, and this is also why Twkster really needed to be here, because the perception I get from Zibo is that it's irrelevant to the Zibo mod because we've got our own flight model. That's the perception I get. But I can't confirm, you understand? So
I was assuming that Twkster's fixes was to counteract something that Lamina had done.
apparently not. But again, this is why we would have liked to ask him. You know, he could have obviously now given us the whole lowdown, but now he doesn't get his mic working. So, yeah. Hold that question. When he comes, you can ask him.
Thanks.
Right, well, there's no point in continuing further on the FMC until this is loaded. So we're getting there. That is a beautiful bird, eh? Don't you think? What a beautiful aircraft.
Nico, is that livery available or only reserved for you?
This one, no, this one's available. You can get it.
Oh, great. I'll go and look for it.
It's on x-plane.to. You know what? If you download the Zibo mod from Explain.to, it's also included. It's just not included in the versions that is on our Google Drives. For some reason, Zibo omitted it from version 4. It was included with the Zibo mod as standard in version 3, but I don't know if he forgot or just didn't want to do it or whatever. It's just not in version 4. So anyway, it is on. Let me show you. It is on explain.to.
Yeah, I saw it there. I just didn't bother to make a account to go get it.
That is a good question. I think the big dream, KVK, is to have the most realistic 737-800 in any simulator. Okay. I remember back in the day, a couple of people laughed at Zibo and obviously us because of the big dream, but I think they have to be honest. Okay, Twkster says yeah, he can't get the sound going. Damn. Give me a second. So, Twkster, can you actually hear me speak? Can you hear my voice? It's so strange. So strange. He was here the other day. So strange. Anyhow. Okay. Sorry, KVK. Attention got split there. So anyway, to make the most realistic 737 in any sim obviously costs a lot of time, a lot of effort. Right, so I think if you look at the Zibo mod, there's a lot of work that still needs to happen. You know, it gets done bit by bit and piece by piece, and then, you know, you have to compensate for the changes laminar makes as well, and all those things. So this won't be done in a while still to come. Okay, there's just too many things that still can be done. We've spoken about quite a lot of things we want to put in there, but I'm not going to mention that really because it's all pie in the sky yet. You know, we'll get there. So for me, this has actually become more than just hobby. It's kind of like a way of life now. You know, it's you wake up at Zibo, you go sleep at Zibo, and Zibo in between. You know, then you work, then you have family time, and then it's Zibo again. So, yeah, one of those things. We'll see where it ends, but there's no, you know, nothing stopping us at this point in time, so we can continue for a long time. I don't know. We haven't spoken about circuit breakers, I must be honest. Let's see what Zibo says. One circuit breaker already working a long time. Okay, we're not saying anything, don't worry. So, there's possibilities, there's things that can come. We don't know. It's difficult to say because I think if we start talking about things that can come or that we are talking about or thinking about, then it creates an expectation. So instead of creating an expectation, it's easier not to say anything and then just surprise you when it happens. You know, silly way of doing it, but I think it's the best way of doing it. Alright, so, yeah, I don't know. We'll have to see anyway, because now Zibo's talking to me as well. We'll see what happens, and we'll just tell you when it happens. Hello, Archibras. Right, everything is loaded, we can continue. Right. Is that true? Let's go check it first. 58.3, so that is true. You can leave that. That is true. Right, now let's go check that graph. Hello, Jean-Pierre. Right, okay, so the landing weight CG is a little bit to the back. That's why we've got the trim where the trim is. Okay. That's why the trim is low. Zibo's naughty. It's giving me a challenge that I can't talk about. Can you believe that? Anyways, let's continue. Okay, what else do we need to do?
That's very bad of him.
Yeah. He's in a good mood.
Just like you were earlier, yes.
Yeah,
You were naughty.
Yeah, what can we say? Okay, let Linda do the trim for us. Why not?
Trim down. Pre-flight procedure.
Let her do that side of things. Okay. $145, 25. Right there. Okay, so that is all done. Let's do the pushback side.
Please show me where you want to go. Show is driving up.
And she's doing the APU. Good stuff. Come on. There you go. I'm going to just skip a couple of stages here with this lady. She's a bit slow now.
Okay, all doors and hatches are closed. Ready to connect.
Right, so all the doors closed, ground services
Please
almost
check that
gone.
the
These
flight
guys
level
will
is
go
set
soon.
correctly.
I think there
Please
we
check
go,
that
they
the landing
go.
altitude is set correctly.
Yeah, you probably changed it now again, eh? Yeah.
So connected and bypass pin inserted. Release parking brake.
We'll give Linda just a second or two.
Pull up. Wind shear. Wind shear. Wind shear. Terrain. Terrain. Pull up. Obstacle. Obstacle. Pull up. Airspeed low.
Adjust vertical speed. Adjust. Climb. Climb now. Climb. Climb
Pre-flight
now.
Sorry,
procedure
Twkster, I missed
Crossing.
that.
Climb. Climb.
Okay.
Crossing.
Alright,
Climb.
cool.
I'm ready for
Climb.
pre-flight checklist.
Climb. Clear of conflict.
Twkster says he's
Descend.
going to reboot his
Descend.
system because he
Descend.
thinks something's
Crossing.
interfering. I hope he gets it right.
Descend. Crossing. Descend. Descend. Descend now. Descend. Descend now. Increase climb. Increase climb. Increase descent. Increase descent. Maintain vertical speed. Maintain. Maintain vertical speed. Crossing. Maintain. Monitor vertical speed. TCAS test. Pass.
Right, let's skip a bit some of these things. Before start procedure. Before start procedure. There we go.
Before start procedure.
Starting pushback. You may start the engine.
Before start procedure complete. Ready for before start checklist.
Before start checklist.
Before start checklist. Papers.
On board.
Flight deck door.
Ah, Trish did
Closed
the
and
thing.
locked.
Good.
Fuel.
Pumps on.
Pumps on. Passenger signs. On. Window.
Locked.
Locked. MCP. Speed 145. Heading 25. Altitude 26,000. Takeoff speeds. V1 133. V rotate 135. V2 145. CDU pre-flight. Pre-flight checklist.
Ah, I
Voice
hate
recorder.
that stupid thing. Come on,
All
it's
commands
just
and checklists
that is
aborted.
just such a small place to actually click. Anyway, my bad. Sorry. Start number 2 engine.
Operation complete. Set parking brake.
Starting number 2 engine.
Disconnecting tow. Stand by.
Twenty-five and 2.
Tow is disconnected and bypass pin has been removed. Hand signal on the left. We'll see you
Starter
next time
cutout.
and have a safe flight.
Start number 1 engine.
Starting number 1 engine. Flaps 5 set. Twenty-five and 2. Ready for before taxi procedure. Starter cutout. Engine start procedure complete.
Before taxi procedure.
Before taxi procedure.
James, check that your failures are not activated, man. Explained failures don't really work well with Zibo anyway, so just make sure it's off.
Before taxi procedure complete.
Right,
I
let's
am
go.
ready for before taxi checklist.
Okay. Gents, I just asked Zibo, that refueling guy, remember we couldn't hear him? I was on the outside. He says you can only hear him when you
Taxi
are in the
lights on.
cockpit. So I suppose it's a representative of actually talking to him through the headset, through the radio, or, physical link into the cockpit, into the headset at least. Makes sense. Yeah, thanks,
Yeah.
Zibo. All the small detail, huh? Hi, Wycliffe.
Cabin crew, take your seats, prepare
Yeah,
for takeoff.
man, we took so long. We've been on the ground 38 minutes already. We need to get some airtime now.
Test. Can you hear me?
Wonderful, yes. Hello, Twkster.
Sorry about that.
No
It's had a
problem.
configuration issue. I had to chase it down.
No problem. You have no idea how glad I am you are here, man. I'm just so grateful, thankful that you are here.
Well, I missed out on a lot of what you were saying because I had to reboot my computer and then bring it back up.
Not a problem.
So anyway, I'm here at the moment.
Good. Twkster, let me give you a quick recap, okay? I said to the guys, basically, we want you to explain the neutral shift thing again, okay? So we get the understanding of this new thing you put into the Zibo. And then obviously just share the evening with you. I think it's got the most value if you try and explain it instead of me just copy and pasting from Google, which I've already done, So let me get into the air and then I'll give the floor to you and you can explain the flight model, the changes and all these things for us, if you don't mind.
Not a problem. I'll be glad to do that. Just let me know when you want me to jabber on.
Good.
This is obviously better than trying to text chat, the
Of course.
explanations, which is
Of course.
much more time consuming.
Approaching 0,
Of course,
3.
of course. Yeah, I'm just going to do the takeoff roll quickly. But you know what? Take the floor. I mean, I'm just going to keep quiet. I'll do my thing. I'll
Runway
fly the
02
aircraft to you.
confirmed.
You're welcome. Take the floor and you can tell us what you did and didn't do and why.
0, 3.
Okay, for those that are listening and watching, just my apologies for taking a little while to get on stream here. It's not something I do every day, so I had to kind of regroup, get all of the stuff from my simulator building, because that's what's dominating my time right now. Had to get that out of the way and reinstall my microphone system here for the stream.
Stabilize.
Anyway, what we have done here is, and Zibo deserves the most credit for this because of his expert tuning and his programming. I could not have done this part of the modification myself without Zibo's direct intervention. So his programming is what makes this thing work. I offered the concept. He was familiar with what I was talking about, and then very quickly, using some charts that we had available, he was able to do the programming. What we're doing right now during the takeoff roll is one of the main purposes of this modification, and I don't know if it was noticed during the rotation here, but the job of this, number one, is to give more authority to the elevator during certain modes of flight, in particular takeoff rotation and landing flare. We have fought with programming within Laminar's structure for a long time, trying to solve the problem of how do we get enough elevator effectiveness stabilizer effectiveness, and yet at the same time able to have, proper trim response, have the ability to trim throughout the flight regime, how to get the proper rotation deck angle. When you set the trim on takeoff, if it's properly set, when you rotate the aircraft to takeoff pitch attitude into the command bars, you relax the control yoke, everything being set up correctly, the pitch attitude should be pretty constant. In other words, it shouldn't want to rotate the nose up higher too much or drop the nose. Now, this is something that in the real airplane and in all jets that I've flown, you're not going to get it exact. But what you want is to be pretty close so the aircraft is pretty stable in that initial climb attitude. So that's one of the main things that is difficult to set within laminars modeling to get that stabilizer force just right, so that when we pull back on the elevator, we've got the proper amount of force in pulling the stick, how far we have to pull the stick back, get the nose up, and that the nose will stay pretty much where we want it during initial takeoff. Now, the biggest issue here is not for a normal takeoff, but if you did have an engine failure, say at V1, then this becomes critical. In the real airplane, obviously we want to make sure that the nose stays up but doesn't continue to drift upwards, causing the speed to drop below V2 speed, which could be catastrophic in a real airplane. On the other hand, if the nose tends to drop and we're close to the ground, that's also pretty dangerous. So, getting that pitch attitude just right and have that trim do its job is really what we're after. Obviously trying to get a very realistic sense of force. Now, with different sticks, everybody's got different controllers, different yokes. As some have heard me say in some of the forums over time, in order to get really accurate as close as possible, we have to tune our sticks as well as tune the flight model. The flight model is only 50% of the job. The other 50% is in the controllers we use to get as close to actual reaction of the aircraft per our stick and or yoke input, or rudder for that matter. So anyway, those are the two main things, is trying to get proper elevator and proper response during the takeoff and landing. Some of may have noticed that if you hand fly the aircraft and you try to take it up to maximum speed, say up to VMO or MMO, when you get all the way up to say close to 340 knots, in the past we used to easily run out of trim. And that's one of the other issues that we have to deal with, is to broaden that envelope to allow us not to run out of trim capacity, but at the same time still keep these other forces we were just talking about in proper balance. So it's a very tight rope when we were just working with elevator and stabilizer. During research of the systems, and of course one of the things that Zibo has been doing over the last several years is continually modeling and improving on the systems in the airplane. And you're all well aware of that. I mean, when we first started out with this project, or I should say that the Zibo was first started out long before I showed up, about a year before I showed up. Zibo had started to take and remodel the stock airplane, which had no moving or working switches hardly. All of this interface is, of course, from Zibo's hard work. Once he got all the switches working, and we got the flight model working fairly well, then he did the deep dive into systems. And this is one of those incremental improvements in systems. And that is the what they call the elevator neutral shift. Now, the elevator neutral shift, what it does is it offsets the elevator from a faired position depending on a couple of factors. One of those is stabilizer setting, and the other one is center of gravity, And the third dynamic is, do we have flaps extended or do we not have flaps extended? So it's a little bit complex, all right, in that optimum settings for the elevator and the stabilizer are determined by all these three areas. So if I have a very forward CG versus a very aft CG, my elevator neutral shift point will be different. For obvious reasons. If you have a very forward CG, we need more nose-up trim normally. The problem is if we use the stabilizer to account for all of that without shifting the elevator neutral point, one of the things that happens is you end up with a less efficient, i.e. higher drag scenario. So as I understand it, that's one of the reasons why Boeing came up with the design in addition to pitch authority. And so anyway, there's those three things, flap setting or no flap setting, center of gravity location, and what is the current stabilizer setting in flight, which of course is also determined by airspeed, because the faster we go, then you're going to need more nose down trim. The slower we're going towards the minimum maneuvering speed, the more nose up trim that is needed in a conventional positive stability scenario. So as the trim changes over its range, depending on airspeed and flap setting and center of gravity, you can see how complex all of that is. Now, Zibo has modeled this very quickly yesterday after we had a discussion about it. We both had access to the same Boeing charts and graphics that explained how the system works, generally speaking. And he quickly was able to program this yesterday based on our discussion. And then after the fact, I had to modify the stabilizer airfoils to produce a more appropriate coefficient of lift at the various stabilizer settings. So I had to recurve the stabilizer airfoils and add more coefficient of lift to it, because what the elevator shift does normally is counterintuitive, because if I have the stabilizer in a nose-up position, most of the elevator shift is actually moving the elevator in the opposite direction. So if I'm got nose up on the stabilizer, the more nose up I have, the more negative shift on the elevator I have. In other words, instead of moving up, which would seem to support stabilizer operation, it actually moves the elevator down. So that's a little counterintuitive. But that comes back to partly because of the efficiencies that Boeing was trying to create. And logic being that if we're using elevator downshift during takeoff, in other words, if you were to look at it, get out of the aircraft, do the shift 4, go out and look, zoom in on the stabilizer, you'll notice after you have your takeoff setting in there, you can see the elevator is canted down just a little bit. And that's the setting that's a result of elevator shift, instead of it being faired or neutral. One of the things this allows us to do, like I said, is to increase the stabilizer force capability. At least that's the theory of it. And end up with all of those other parameters we were talking about in the beginning still fall in line. In other words, we still have trim. Actually, we have a little bit improved trim capacity throughout the regime, i.e. up at high speed. Those who have been using the Zibo mod for a while, there was a time there when we were trying to tune all these things without elevator shift, where if you hand flew the airplane at speeds, say, up much more than 280 to 300 knots, you would run out of trim. Yet everything else was working fine. That was one of the limitations of not having elevator shift. It took us right to the edge of our ability to tune the elevator and the stabilizer to work together effectively enough. And yet, still, if I had set it up so that I could trim all the way through the range, then one of the other parameters, like takeoff stab setting, for instance, your elevator authority, how much pull is required, all those things would have been affected. So each and every one of those different areas is kind of like a, you're teetering on the top of a pendulum, trying to find the exact right balance. And this was very limited before we put the elevator shift in. So Zibo was just telling me this morning that, or just a few minutes ago, that he has now added some additional tuning capability so that we can further refine this and make it even more effective than it is now. And we're hopeful that what we're going to have is close to obviously the goal is always to get as close to the real aircraft as possible. So that's about it for the initial explanation. If I forgot something somebody has questions about, I'm more than happy to entertain those.
I'm happy, Tim. Thank you so much for the explanation. I mean, that's something the little copy and paste from Google would never have told us. Thank you for the knowledge and thank you for implementing it for us, because now we can fly it better.
Ready for descent.
Like I say, mostly it's Zibo's programming wizardry is what gets the job done here. It's something that I've been thinking about for a long time, and he was obviously aware of it already. We had basically had very minor discussions in the past, but nothing significant. But yesterday it all came to a head, and he very quickly was able to program it as per both of our understanding of how the system worked. And I thought he nailed it pretty well on the initial rendition of it. And now he has created additional tools that will allow us to further develop and or tune it.
That's amazing.
For more improvement.
Well, thank you, Zibo. And, you guys are obviously a very good team, and we love you for it. Thank you for all you do for us.
Okay, well, that's great.
Yeah.
Now, if you want to try some of these things, I don't know if you've ever done that where you hand fly the airplane right up to MMO. You'll notice that one of the things that happens when you don't have the autopilot on, or you do not have the flaps extended, in the real aircraft, of course, then your forward trim is limited, right? And depending on which model of I started to say the 2000, which is the airplane I fly right now.
Yeah.
But the NG, depending on which version you're flying, is going to have a forward trim stop, right? When the flaps are retracted and or the autopilot is off, right?
Okay.
So when the autopilot's on, it has full trim authority, whatever it needs. But when the autopilot is off, when one looks in the FCOM, we can find that there is a forward trim limit.
Okay.
Now, finding the balance between that forward trim limit and airspeed is very that's one of the problems that we were running into. Now, to be fair, real airplanes don't always give you the ability to trim all the way to the forward limits within the airspeed envelope, because all of this is dependent on your center of gravity. If you have a very aft center of gravity, you're going to need more nose down trim. If you have a very forward center of gravity, of course, you're going to need more nose up trim. The problem being here, nose down trim with an aft center of gravity and high airspeed. So when I used to fly the Boeing 747, particularly in freighters, surprisingly, you could run out of trim during the approach. You'd have the nose trimmed all the way forward, and yet you didn't have enough trim left, and you had to kind of manually overcome it. And that was perfectly legal within the weight and balance limitations of the aircraft, surprisingly. But it's what happens when you get to the very edge of the envelope sometimes in a configuration that's not usually flown. And a good example of that is in freighters. You're always flying them at maximum weight. You want the most payload you can put on the airplane to make it profitable. So it was easy for us to explore all the ends of the envelope in that airplane
Okay.
But it was very strange to run out of trim. I'm not saying that's a normal feature in the 737NG, not by any means, but having limitations to trim authority is not unusual, and it's acceptable in many cases within certain limitations that the FAA and EASA particularly put on this for certification. So,
Okay.
but anyway, if you were to try that, now this test, by the way, if you want to try it, it's up to you.
Yeah.
But having the autopilot on when you do it will not show the issue because
No, we can switch
you've
it
got
off. We
trim authority.
You just tell me
so
what
you
I
switch
need
it
to
off.
do.
Yeah, just switch it off and put it up to max climb thrust and accelerate right on up until you run out of trim. Try to hold level flight, of course, and that's the whole idea. Is we'll trim forward and while the power's coming in, and then at some point you usually run out of trim. Ideally, what we want to do, if our CG's not too farly aft, we want to be able to trim pretty close to VMO, which is 340.
Yeah, the moment the thrust comes in, this thing wants to climb. So I'm already starting.
Yeah, you got to keep trimming. Yeah, that's one of those pilot skills, right? We got to constantly trim to keep the nose neutral as we're accelerating. So if you don't get it exactly perfect, that's understandable. You don't practice this every day.
No, of course.
Approach top of descent.
Okay, for some reason, I've just noticed that I'm trimming, but it's not moving. There it started to trim. For some reason, it stopped. Look, that stopped. I can't trim more down.
And you're right about 0.0, right?
It looks like
on the trim units.
No, in the trim units, it's between 3 and 4. And it's
stopped. It should be about 3.75.
Yeah.
Now, it depends on what CG you started with. I don't know what your CG is right now.
You can have a look. Let me just quickly see. Just want to zoom in here. So it's just before 4. I can't trim more. It just doesn't allow me to trim any more. Let me just unpause it again. If I trim manually, see, I can go further, but electronically I can't. So there it stops me.
Right.
There it physically now stops me. And we're going nose down now anyway. So this is now at 3.7 approximately what you said. It's just under 4.
Yeah, and so if you keep it level and let it continue to accelerate,
well,
keep the nose up.
We're gonna have to pull back up now a little bit.
There we are.
Come on. All right. Well, there we at the brink of the red there.
Yeah.
Okay, I can't trim anymore. It's not trimming.
Yeah,
anymore.
no problem. But that showed you that, it used to be that we would be lucky to get above about 280 knots.
Yeah.
And then you'd run out of trim. And unless you're, it's very unusual for people to be hand flying the airplane at 320 knots. But it's something we should be able to do.
Yeah.
So anyway, that was just for that. Now, if you were to put the autopilot on and then go look at your stable or your center of gravity that you started out with.
So that's what we started out with, and if we go, where we can see it actually.
Which is a pretty average center of gravity, right?
Yeah. I just need to pull back. We're going to overspeed heavy now. I'm sorry.
In any case, you can see that if your CG was further aft, it's one of the discussions we see on the forum all the time. Or I shouldn't say all the time, is we just saw it the other day, somebody discussing the fact that a lot of airlines like to load for aft CG. And that's true, because the further aft the CG and maintain a stable platform you have, the better the fuel efficiency. And over a whole fleet of aircraft, that makes a huge difference over the course of an airline's fiscal year. Is,
Of course.
the fact that they have a more efficient fuel use. But as you load aft, that limits the amount of the trim you would have in this high-speed regime. So if you were to go with a very aft limit, you'd find that your trim would be more at a lower airspeed would be where you'd run out of that electric
Gotcha.
trim without having to go to manual, right?
Well, this thing ran out of trim, I would say just before 4. That's on the electronic one, and then when I turned my wheel, I could take it that little notch a bit further,
To be honest, I have to look in the book. It varies for the different, whether you're flying a 700, an 800, or a 900 NG, as I recall. It can be, that trim stop could be at 3.75, or it could be as high as 4.25. I think Zibo has it set somewhere around 4.1, but obviously what he's done is he's set it to whatever is appropriate for the 800.
Of course.
Right. So that was the one aspect of it. Now, something, this is something that a lot of people may not appreciate, but, having the stabilizer and the elevator function correctly, along with an aircraft that's properly loaded, affects the stability. We're talking about stability all the time, but what we're looking for is positive static and dynamic stability. That's the way the airplane was designed to fly. So what does that really mean? Static stability is the tendency of an aircraft to either diverge from its flight path, stay at its same flight path, or converge back to its original flight path if it's disturbed. Now, over time, that's dynamic stability. And what happens when we let the aircraft self-correct over time? This is one of the tests of whether or not your flight model is actually realistic. Because if you have too much static artificial stability built into the simulator, the natural static and dynamic stability will be degraded. It won't function correctly. And if anybody's ever flown a flight model before where you put the nose up and then let go of the stick, and then the nose just stays up, say, at 10 degrees or 15 degrees for a very long time till the airspeed gets really, really low, and then maybe it falls off, maybe it doesn't, or maybe it just stays there until the aircraft stalls. That's a big sign that whoever developed the aircraft added artificial stability because they think it makes their airplane fly better. It's an illusion because the airplane isn't flying accurately to a real aircraft at all when it's like that. Now, you can test that in the Zibo here. You put it at level flight there, where your airspeed is right now, right at 262 is just fine. But trim it for level flight so that hands off it stays just about where you want it and the airspeed is constant.
Okay, give me a second.
I.e.
Let me try and get it stable, and then you talk me through it, Twkster. Try and get
no
it
problem.
stable. Okay, so let's try this. You say I need to get it stable, then what's next?
Okay, once you have it stable, the airplane's level flight, airspeed is not increasing or decreasing. We now know that thrust, drag, lift, and gravity are all in balance, right?
Okay. Yeah.
So once we find that in level flight, then in level flight, lift the nose up to say 15 degrees, and then just release your stick and let the aircraft go. Let it do its thing.
All right, I'm going to do that now. Just
leave the thrust exactly where you had it.
Yeah.
All right, so just smoothly bring the nose up to about 15 degrees. And then after you get to 15 degrees, just smoothly center the stick and let go of it.
There you go, done.
Okay, so as you do that, you're going to notice right away airspeed's decaying. as airspeed decays, so does lift. The nose starts to come down.
Yep.
And it will continue to come down as the airspeed's decaying. And it'll go right on through the horizon. And then it'll get down to a minimum. And you might want to take a mental note of what that airspeed was or is when it gets to its lowest pitch attitude. Because over time, what we're looking for is almost like a roller coaster effect where the pitch forces or pitch changes and airspeed changes will get smaller and smaller and smaller until we get back to level flight, the original airspeed at the original altitude we entered at. And that's generally what we're looking for in a stable aerodynamic platform.
Okay.
And see the nose is starting to come back up now?
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, it's a lot slower process up here at, say, 15,000 feet. But if you were down at 5,000 feet and you did this, you'd see these oscillations occurring a lot faster.
Gotcha.
Now, do you have any static stability dialed in right now to your flight model, or?
No, I didn't. I'm set up as per my Zibo install guide, so there's nothing added or something that I wouldn't know of or can't change if you want me to change it, so I can show you what I've got.
I don't know. No problems.
Okay.
I'm just noticing this seems to be oscillating a lot slower than what I would have expected it to. But I'll be honest, I don't do this test at 15,000 feet. Normally I do it down around 5,000.
Yeah. Twkster, the only thing I do in the explain settings opposed to what you do is you've got your joystick sliders on the left and mine's on the right, but that's all. The rest, there's no augmentation.
That'll make all that different. That'll make that difference right there.
Okay.
You know, I'm not saying you can't do that. If your airplane flies okay and the autopilot works okay, all of that, but that does affect how all of this reacts. If your sliders were all to the left, I think you would find that it would probably...
Yeah, but remember, I'm not talking about augmentation. I'm just talking about the normal joystick forces. Let's quickly have a look. See, let me show you. See, your control responses. So this is what happens with the joystick. In X-Plane 12, we don't have that augmentation anymore. So I'm not changing the flight model. I'm not doing anything. All this does for me is it makes the aircraft feel heavier. When I put it all to the left, it's too flimsy, too but special. Like,
it's, you know, and I don't say this to for the. I hope you'll take this as intended. But that's always normal when you're not a real pilot, because you're not used to dealing with an aircraft that's fluidly dynamic like that. So it always feels like it's unstable. But what you've done when you paint those all the way to the right like that, that does affect the flight model, whether you realize it or not. And that's why these oscillations are really slow, because it's like adding molasses to the flight control system.
Okay, let's quickly change it and let's see
not,
what happens.
You know, if you want to fly it there and you're happy with how everything is functioning, that's fine.
No,
but the best thing we can do, the best thing we can do is to, you know, is to practice with hand flying till you get to a point where you become part of the stability factor. So now if you were to do that same thing, pull your nose up, now it should oscillate faster than what it did.
We're gonna try it.
But that's when I first saw that, and it wasn't, you know, following the pattern that I did in development. Then to me, that's the first thing that caused me to ask, have we added any artificial stability? And essentially, when you say it makes it feel heavier, that's what it's doing. It's actually adding a little stability augmentation. Because it is changing the way the aircraft flight controls interact with the airframe at the center position. So, you know, it's kind of counterintuitive that when we move that it actually has an effect on the flight model itself, but it actually does. Unfortunately, that's the way Laminar designed this thing. So, but
no problem.
Now that's the reason why I run them to the full left. But, and then we're relying only on the aircraft's normal static and dynamic stability to create a stable platform. And so that's why I recommend that. Again,
I'm with you.
each individual, depending on their controllers that they have, whether you're using a yoke, you're using a stick, whether you've got rudder pedals or you don't, obviously how you choose to place your controller sensitivities is up to you. And the bottom line is, if it works and everything functions correctly and you're happy with it, that's all that's important. But
well, look at these curves. Zibo's also chatting with me in the background while you're talking, and he's telling me you're right and I'm wrong, kind of a thing in a nice way, Okay.
Well, I'll be fair about this. I'll be honest. My perspective is one of a pilot, who's been flying heavy and large jets for almost 40 years now. So, and teaching them also. So, one of the things that, it's only natural for me that my perspective is always from one of a pilot. Mm-hmm. And I understand completely. There are many similar simmers out there who don't have a clue how to hand fly the airplane through no fault of their own, because they haven't yet learned the basics of flight. It's difficult in a simulator to do that effectively unless we have an airplane that flies extremely accurately and we got good controllers. But then that gives us the basis to start to learn so that we can actually practice it. Now, I've been threatening for a long time to start teaching an online course on basic handling of jet airplanes. And the only reason why I haven't done it yet is because, for the last year and a half, I've been trying to get my home cockpit built, which is very time consuming and takes me away from, continuing to fine tune the Zibo flight model. You as yourself had said it's very time consuming to tune the flight model because you have to do test after test after test, record data, look at the variations, and then come up with some kind of hypothesis on, how are you going to affect that. And the better you get at it over time, you can reduce the time constraint. But I can't tell you how many hundreds and hundreds of hours I wasted in the early days doing flight testing of concepts that just flat didn't work in the end, and I'd have to throw out the concept, start over. Part of that was because I'm not an aerodynamic engineer, and part of that was because we're dealing with a desktop simulation, which is not a real airplane, right? So, but we've been very fortunate in what we've been able to accomplish. Like I say, if Zibo wasn't so astute to this and wanting to make sure everything was as accurate as possible, we would have never gotten to the point we're at right now. And I salute him for that, because I really appreciate it, especially, with his background. He's, by his own admission, not a pilot, but he has learned a tremendous amount in the process of doing this, and he's really sharp. He understands what we're trying to accomplish. It's very rare that him and I have a disagreement on anything, because he's done his homework.
Yeah,
But anyway, you can see that there's probably a little difference there in how it's responding as you're doing this. But anyway, if you don't find that you're happy with those settings, there's another way you can deal with this also, and that is to change your curves. You can modify your curves instead of just putting all those sliders to the right. It takes a little while, but you can also modify your pitch, your roll, and your yaw curves so that your individual controller responds the way you want it to, instead of the defaults, which, even if you got a good quality controller, they don't always give us the response that we would like to see. And the people that are using, and I started out with a low quality stick, a $30, stick that I bought at the toy store, right?
Yeah,
well, obviously you're not going to get, we're not going to get the same fidelity out of those that we would in
Of
in
course.
a better quality one. But even the best one you can buy out of the box is not going to be absolutely right without tuning.
No, I agree.
So,
I agree. Well, Twkster,
Yeah.
while you're talking, somebody's playing me back to myself. Can you please mute the sounds? Zibo's been talking to me, and he actually, I've been arguing with him, and I said to him, but I didn't change my linear curve thing there in the controllers. He said, no, I must check. So I went and checked, and I found it's not linear. So he's been prompting me to follow your lead here in the background the whole time as you're talking. Okay, so my feeling is I need to fly with it a little bit. I wanted to feel the weight, so I pulled my sliders to the right. So now I'm going to, for the first time in my life, try it the other way, and let's see, with the linear, line there on one side.
It will take a little bit of practice.
Yeah.
And what I can tell you is the same. When I end up finally getting around to doing a video on basic handling on how to fly the jet, we start with the basics, as in all things, right? The old saying, we have to learn to crawl before we can learn to walk, or before we can learn to run, and that's true in flying aircraft. And as simulators become more and more realistic, we now have to rely more and more on the same techniques we would use as we do in a real aircraft. And that's one of the first things you struggle with as a brand new pilot, a student pilot, is how to control pitch for altitude and vertical rate and keep the airspeed stable, and how to maintain a constant course or heading while doing all this manually, right? And at the same time, monitoring everything that's going on. It can be overwhelming at first, but the only thing I can say is it requires continual practice until, like riding a unicycle, it becomes second nature.
Yeah.
And the unicycle is probably the best example. If I was to try and jump on a unicycle and ride it today, it would be a 100% failure, no doubt, because I'm not a unicyclist. But obviously it can be done, and those people have to learn the dynamics of how to maintain that unicycle in a stable platform. And about probably 70 or 80% of that, and I'm just guessing, but about 70-80% of that is subconscious in their body talking to them about their balance. And then they automatically correct with forward or back pedal to try and keep that balancing point just where it belongs. Well, that's exactly what happens when we're flying an airplane in 3 dimensions, right?
Yes.
We have to automatically learn to constantly trim the airplane to maintain the proper relationship, right? And that's the first thing that we'll need to learn. So I would say, in order to get feel comfortable with flying the aircraft with all of your sliders to the left, is practice what we did at first in the video here. Accelerate up to a high speed while trimming it in level flight manually, right? And then do the same thing, pull the throttle smoothly to idle and slow it all the way down to minimum maneuvering speed while continuing to do the same thing. And if you do this repeatedly with practice, you'll find that you're very good maintaining altitude, course, and everything while you're trimming the aircraft to keep it dynamically centered, so to speak. This is one of the biggest problems in instrument flying, right? When a pilot's in cloud or at night and he has no horizon, he has to, of course, rely on the instruments. If I'm hand flying it, not on the autopilot, if I need to do something like reach over and pick up something out of my book bag, or for whatever reason I look away from my instruments for more than a second or two, right? I want to make sure that the platform is stable for good, obvious reasons, right? You don't want to, if natural human tendency is that if I look to the right without even realizing it, I bank to the right.
Yeah.
Right? So it's one of these things, but when I develop the airplane to be trim stable, that means I can look away from my instruments for several seconds, unless I'm in turbulence or something, and then come back to it, and the airplane will be right where I left it. The airspeed will be within a few knots. Altitude will be almost right on. Heading will still be right on. Because before I ever looked away from that attitude indicator, by habit, I made sure that the aircraft was fully in trim.
Approaching
Absolutely.
transition.
Right.
Absolutely.
So this is a becomes like the unicycle example, because something we do subconsciously, automatically, continually. So as one thing that you'll have to that I tell new pilots or lesser experienced, because all the guys I work with coming into a jet airplane, they're all pilots already. They're licensed, but maybe it's the first time they ever flew a jet airplane. Now they're going from a 172 to, that does 100 knots to something that can do 500
Transition
knots.
level. Ready for approach
so
checklist.
they need a little bit of help to transition their techniques. So I usually teach this kind of stuff, and it works best in the flying simulator itself, but I can teach these techniques in the airplane too.
Good,
And,
good. Yeah, no, that's cool. Look,
so then after you do that, just one more thing. After you do that, then you can practice doing turns while in level flight to start with, right?
Yeah.
Left and right, same thing while you're transitioning airspeed. You're trying to keep altitude, keep the trim coming in. One of the things you'll note, obviously, is anytime you bank the airplane, it actually takes more trim than it did when it was in level flight.
Absolutely.
For the offset lift. So anyway, those are just a couple of techniques you can use to help you get more used to flying with your sliders the other direction. Once you get used to it, I think that you'll find that it's much more preferable, because you're going to have, when you hand fly the airplane, you will end up with far superior control of the aircraft. So.
Well, that's homework for me then. We'll go try it. Twkster, just for your information and also for Gary there on the stream, I was under the impression I am in a linear line there in my controllers. I never set those things. So that brings up an interesting question for me, is how did it change? Or is that how Laminar gives it? I don't know.
Yeah, Laminar defaults to that. It's in cubic. Is that what it
Yeah, it
said?
was something like that. I can't remember. Yeah, so obviously I just left it as default. So Zibo, thank you for forcing me to go check, and Twkster, thank you for explaining why I had to go and check and all the other stories. It's amazing, man.
Well, you will find that if you once you get kind of used to what's going on with the airplane with the sliders to the left, if you're still unhappy with now, and I say a lot of this because, even if two of us sit side by side with the same model flight controller, especially the ones that use POT instead of using, magnetic sensor, which is just much better way to go, but more expensive. So if you have two controllers of the same exact model, side by side, they will perform differently. Because of the pots that are installed in them.
Yes.
So a little bit of tuning, and the best place to tune it is in those curves, right?
Yeah. Yes.
Rather than the sliders, because the sliders, they're basically, when I move the slider, it's just arbitrarily setting a consistent curve. And if you look at Laminar never used to explain this, but their more recent guide on this does explain that when I move my sliders to the right, it doesn't show up in the screen there that you look at, but basically I'm creating a curve in that controller, which starts out more gradually and then slowly curves up as I move the controller towards full travel, rather than it being a straight line between 0 and max, right?
Gotcha.
So you're doing kind of the same thing you can do in the curves. The issue with the curves is you can customize that exactly how you want it, and you don't end up with a pre-formatted curve that Laminar designed into it when they, as you move the sliders to the right. So a good example of that is, if you've got a really good quality controller, you should be able to get away with almost no noise suppression in the EFB.
Yes.
I.e., right? And I think you said earlier that you had yours set at 3. The
Yes,
pitch?
the noise is for the auto throttle or
Cabin
controller or
crew,
something. Wait,
take your
let me go
seats,
check.
prepare
Let
for
me check
landing.
because now I'm gonna lie. It's under hardware. Yeah, it's for the throttle noise locks. I've got it at 3. Yes, for the throttles.
Yeah,
I'm
well,
using the Honeycomb Bravo, and every now and then it just deteriorates more and more and more slowly but surely. One day it's just gonna die. But so far so good. You know.
well, there again, that's probably a sign as with use over time, those pots start to get dirty, right? Because
Definitely.
a lot of
Flaps 15
whatever
seconds.
they use in there for conductor graphite or something starts to build up dust in there, and it gets noisy. So yeah, whatever you can get away with is you already know. You well know this already. The minimum you can set that at
Flaps
and have it
30
work
set.
well for you.
Ready for landing
I'm using a
checklist.
Boeing yoke when I'm not messing with my cockpit. This Thrustmaster
Yes.
TCA Boeing yoke, right, does not use pots,
Okay.
right? So it's extremely clean. So I can set that at. I have mine set at 1, and I could probably get away with 0.
Yeah.
Because there's no noise at center at all.
On my Alpha yoke, I have no noise. Mine's all at 0. It's just on the Bravo.
Approaching.
So,
1 second.
I mean, depending on, again, the 2 individual controllers side by side may require individual tuning. So, this is something that I should probably be more preachy about it when I'm on the forums to kind of get people educated about, if they have a problem with the way their aircraft is handling, then the first thing they need to do is obviously calibrate their systems regularly. But the second one is tune it to your personal liking.
Yeah.
Right? Because we can't make the flight model be one solution for all controllers.
Absolutely.
So anyway.
There's something else I just want to quickly mention to Zibo. Zibo, I hope you're still watching. Just give me a thumbs up if you hear me. I don't know if you noticed, but look, we obviously messed around with the aircraft a lot, but my auto throttle did not disconnect. I disconnected it at some point in time, and I've been pulling on the speed brake and going crazy. It hasn't done it again, and the only difference is I mapped it through the actual explain instead of the EFB. So I'm going to have to test it a little bit more, but just bear it in mind. Sorry, that was just for
feet remaining. 4,000 remaining.
Alright, for some reason we never went into reverse. Now we've gone into reverse and I didn't pay attention. I was busy about too much.
Just we were talking a lot about
60 knots.
That basically the pitch channel is what we've been discussing this whole time. And there were other little things that were changed in the flight model. They're not major. They're minor incremental changes just to tune it. One of them is those that are maybe paying attention to that during, say, an autopilot approach. I tuned the flaps a little bit to adjust the pitch attitude on final. Because some of the real NG drivers have made comments that the nose is a little bit flat. And of course, that's true. If we look at the Boeing charts, there's charts that tell us, what the pitch attitude ought to be at certain flap settings at VREF or REF plus 10, etc. So anyway, I made some minor tuning adjustments there. It can probably still be further tuned. I just have to be careful about how I do that so that I don't, actually disrupt or destroy other qualities in landing and taking off the aircraft. I.e., if there's 2 ways I can do that, I can change the flap angle, and I can change the coefficient of lift, and I can change the drag. The problem with that is if I add too much drag and reduce the lift too much to change the pitch attitude, then you're going to flare the airplane on landing, and it just sinks right through the flare, and you have a hard landing. That's a good example of that.
Yeah.
So we have to be careful when we make those kind of changes that they were very small and incremental. The other thing, besides doing the the shift that we were talking about, is when X-Plane 12 came out. At first, we modeled the aircraft for the changes, and they were significant. We had to make quite a few changes, and I tell you what, Zibo, and I'm sure you probably remember this, the airplane did not fly well at all when we first tried our X-Plane 11 model in X-Plane 12. And that's because the laminar model was too significantly different. They had made too many changes that affect the airplane's lift and drag profile. So, we finally came up with a solution that seems to work well. But it wasn't by using, and I don't say this to be critical, but it wasn't by using laminar solution, I'll tell you that.
Gotcha. Makes sense.
So one of the things that I had not yet done when we had the, I'm trying to remember where it was, when 1206, I think, when it came out, there were some more flight dynamics changes that laminar did before the recent ones here in 1208, which, by the way, in 1208, I haven't personally found anything that affected the flight dynamics very much. But whenever they made a recent change, and I have to go back in the change log to see, laminar had changed weight and balance.
Okay.
Right? And one of the things that they did when they did that is, I'm almost certain that they changed the reference point for weight and balance to be more like the correct one. Well, in the past, in X-Plane 11, we had to modify the reference point for weight and balance because laminar wasn't using the correct data point.
Gotcha.
They were using an arbitrary data point that worked across all of X-Plane.
Procedure.
But Boeing uses a reference point that is considerably different. It's not right on the nose of the aircraft. So we had to modify our center of gravity in order to adapt for that change. Well, I'm pretty certain, and I haven't seen anything from laminar that directly addresses it, and if somebody has, they can pass it along. But I think they moved that reference point to be more correct for the aircraft. Well, what that means is that our weight and balance now has the wrong reference point that it was based on, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
So it caused our weight and balance not to give the same flight dynamic results that we were expecting. So anyway, without getting too carried away about that, on this change, I shifted the point, what we call it, center of forces, all right, which is not something you can directly change in X-Plane, but basically, where your pitch, roll, and yaw axes all to come together in the aircraft is a certain point on the aircraft. And that, location where everything rotates around, normally you think in terms of it being the center of gravity. That is true for weight and balance. But the actual forces on the aircraft, when I pitch the nose or bank the aircraft, that point in space on the airframe where those forces are applied is not on the center of gravity, but on a specific point on the airplane, which should be behind the center of gravity. And it should be behind the center of lift also. And so this point is how we really create flight dynamic stability, because if the center of gravity moves behind that point, now the airplane becomes very unstable. So anyway, what I did is I moved it aft quite a bit. And the results so far feel really good. But unless I do a significant amount of testing to prove it out, I won't say that it's actually absolutely accurate. I would just say it's a major improvement.
Okay, that's good. Yeah. That's fair enough.
Yeah, so it should find that when you have your sliders all the way to the left, for instance, if that stability point, that point of what we call the neutral point, in the real world they call it the neutral point. When the neutral point is far enough aft, and the CG is forward of that. The more forward the CG is, the more stable the airplane feels. The more we move the CG aft towards the neutral point, the less stable it feels until when it's right on top of the neutral point, then the airplane's very neutral, which is not good. And if you move the CG even further aft, it becomes very unstable. So by moving that aft, we should have created more flight dynamic stability. And so if you've noticed in your last couple of streams, or the last stream and this one, this one you didn't have a chance to really pay attention because I'm talking the whole time. But you will find that it should be more stable overall on the autopilot. That pitch oscillation thing is doesn't really have much to do with that, but I think it did improve it a little bit. But this is something that over time Zibo is going to work on to tune out, because it's, as you well know from past iterations of the autopilot constants, that it's a very difficult and very sensitive setting to get just right, so that the flight model and the autopilot work together in complete harmony throughout the flight envelope. So I'm sure he's going to nail that down pretty soon, and then I think we're going to probably have the sweetest version of the autopilot we've had all along once he nails that. So
sounds amazing, Tim. Sounds absolutely amazing, man. Yeah.
Well, enough of my talking. So.
No worries. No. I invited you, and you came through like a champion, man. I'm so glad you were here and that you could talk us through.
All right. Well, I'm going to have to, like I said, I will sometime in the near future. When I say that, I can't say when. I'm going to start. I want to start putting out some videos on, all of these things I'm talking about. Hand flying the aircraft, particularly. We all, you do an excellent job of teaching people how to use the Zibo mod, explaining all the functionality in the various controls in the aircraft, particularly the Autoflight system. My hat's off to you. You do a great and wonderful job of that.
Thank you.
I think that the one area where we don't have enough guidance is, people, most simmers, of course, are very happy to use the automation all the time. But for those who are really want to go to the next level, of course, that is becoming the master of the aircraft when hand flying.
Yes.
In the real world, when I used to be an examiner, one of the first things in one of the very first paragraphs in the examiner's manual was that the outcome of the flight shall never be in doubt, and that the pilot shall show an absolute command of the aircraft at all times. And that's one of the evaluation things for an examiner when a guy goes for a type rating in a jet airplane. When a two-engine jet, doesn't matter, we're talking about the tiniest ones or the largest ones, on up to the 777. They all use the same rules for how they're designed and how they're evaluated when they train pilots. So if I was, other than the fact that I don't know anything about 777, I could jump in the simulator and I could evaluate a pilot in the 777, all with the exception of his use of systems. But when it comes to hand flying the aircraft accurately, instrument flight techniques, all of these things, they're no different. There's no change from one jet to another. There are some minor differences, of course, but the basics of what a pilot needs for skills are the same. Now, that does vary a little bit from propeller-driven airplanes, and that's one of the things I like to get into is, how we can find ourselves going down the wrong path using, the guys who have, and no fault of their own, I'm not criticizing them, but if a guy's got a private license or even a commercial license, but it's only in propeller-driven aircraft, when he gets into the jet, there are adjustments he has to learn to make, because how to properly fly it is different than how you would fly a propeller-driven aircraft. Not significantly different, but in ways that are important for absolute control and precision. So anyway, that's one of the things I want to start to address later. But I'm like a year behind when I thought I was going to do it originally. But like I said, that's because I'm doing this home cockpit build.
Of course.
So,
Of course. Well,
anyway,
I'm pretty sure you're going to have a lot of guys who want to sign up for that course.
well, I hope so. I understand there's some other people. I heard recently, who was it, Bold Method or somebody was putting together a little ATP course, and I'd be interested to see what they do. But what I'm really talking about is just starting out at the basics and teach people the most basic skill sets so they can build on those, because it's like when we're learning to land, people always come up, it's the same question real pilots would have. Well, how do I land the airplane accurately and consistently? Tell me what I need to do. Well, the first thing we have to do is step back and go back and develop basic handling skills. Because if I don't have a mastery of my basic handling skills, I can't go to the advanced level of landing the airplane, right? And that's an advanced maneuver to land the airplane. Something we do every day in the real world. But by the time we get to where we're doing that, we've gone through a heartache amount of practice and instruction to get to a point where, we're actually have a mastery of all the skill sets we need to accurately control an airplane to a touchdown point. Simulation helps, but we can also develop bad habits if somebody doesn't show us the proper way to do something versus the wrong way. I'm always amazed at how much skill some simulator pilots show in actually hand flying their simulator when they haven't flown a real airplane. My hat is always off to them, but they can improve those skills by getting some of the basics mastered also. So that's why I encourage people to hand fly a lot. So anyway, thanks for inviting me.
You're welcome. You're welcome. And I hope we're going to see you many times more.
Well, yeah, I need to get more back involved, but like I say, the problem with me is I'm not spending enough time online lately. So every minute I'm online, I'm not doing something in all of the projects I've got backed up in my my home sim here. But I want to get that done because I actually want to use that as part of the Zibo program, to take it to the next level. And I don't know how much it's going to help, but having what we've just been discussing here, flight controllers that actually have control loading that I can tune, helps me to better evaluate the effectiveness of the flight model.
Good. That's good. Good luck to you, sir, and thank you for everything that you do for us.
Oh yeah, well my part is small compared to Lubos, I tell you.
Yeah.
What the Zibo does is, I still continue to believe that he does a miraculous job, and he's been consistent. I mean, we're going on almost 8 years now since he started this project.
Yep.
And,
in December it will be 8 years. 8 years.
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah. And I came along. I had no intention of getting involved with the project originally, but I saw the value in it. I think I came along in July or August of, that first year that he was working on it, and it was still very early in the project. So I had not the expertise, but I was certainly willing to try and cure some of the basic handling problems we had in the flight model. And then one thing became another, and then I got more deeply involved in it. And it became an obsession of mine, just as it is of yours. And thankfully, the obsession that Zibo himself has, because if he wasn't so committed to it, this project would have never gotten to where it is today.
Absolutely.
And I know he's still not done with it.
Yep. There's lots to do still, and we're here for the long haul. We're going to be here till the end.
Well, there's a big difference, right? There was a time, as you may, and I'm sure you well remember this, there was a time when, and I'm not I don't want to offend anybody in the audience that may be listening when I say what I am. It's not a judgment. But there was a time when all the guys on the other side of the fence flying the other 737 NG, which we all know which one that is, would just laugh at the Zibo crowd. You know, you're never going to be as good as us. And now, what are we? That airplane gets compared against the Zibo for quality.
I've seen that too.
Right? So the table has turned.
Twkster,
You know?
on that note, let me tell you a quick joke. It's true. When I bring my video out, you'll see it as well. I'm busy making a tutorial where I've got the Zibo mod and the PMDG in the same video. So I'm doing flight planning. Then I fly the one aircraft, then I fly the other aircraft. Same route, same weather, same everything. So one can get a good idea of how they stack up against each other. So I'm not doing that to say the one's better than the other. I don't want to get into that mudslinging. Okay?
And they both have their lane, so to speak. You know,
exactly.
I mean,
exactly. Yeah.
Obviously, Zibo is an X-plane centric aircraft. It's never going to be. At least I don't believe that Zibo will ever develop it for MSFS, because that's like starting from scratch.
Yeah, it will.
But and then for the same reason, PMDG has not ended up porting over to X-plane, I think.
Yeah,
right?
so I'm glad we're each in our own lane, but it's nice to see the two together and to experience them right after another, and you get the same flight, same plan, same everything, same weather. You can see how they just do things a little bit differently.
Oh, you know, I mean, PMDG is obviously, I mean, it shines in many areas, and you know, and I mean, it's getting over time. It's getting to a point where, you know, both of these aircraft are not all that terribly different, and that's really the sign of excellence when somebody who uses PMDG and never has flown the Zibo can climb into the Zibo and then operate it just the way they do PMDG and get the results they're expecting, and or vice versa. Yeah. And that's the actual sign of quality rather than competition. You know, I mean, it's they should be that similar.
No, obviously it's the same. It's supposed to be the same aircraft. You can see the design differences in terms of the software side of things, you know, the simulator side of things. But ultimately, it's 737-800 NGs, you know. And yeah, I'm enjoying making it. It's almost done. It will be another couple of days, and I'll release the video, and the guys can have a look. You know.
Well, I'll be looking forward to watching it.
Cool.
I'm sure, you know, I mean, I personally don't have a copy of PMDG. And that's not a choice. It's just, you know, the only thing I fly in X-plane is the Zibo model. I don't even go and take a tool around the patch in a 172 or, you know, my focus is just different than a lot of simmers. That doesn't mean it's right or wrong. It just means that I have my focus, and that is helping to develop the Zibo. And I do very few actual flights in the Zibo. I do have a few short-range flights that I do repetitively, but they're test patterns for me. You know, to when we make changes in either the Autoflight system or in the flight model itself or something, I can compare, you know, how the aircraft flies on this handling this semi-complex little short route that I fly back and forth between two airports. And but I use that for evaluation. I don't get the opportunity to just for the pure joy of it, going and flying. I don't ever fly on online, you know, and it's just because I have other priorities. And that maybe someday I'll change that, but right now, for the last 7 years, it's every time I go fly the Zibo, mostly it's about testing something. You know, it's not about having an enjoyable flight.
Well,
anyway.
Yeah, listen, the way we've been testing and the way we've been working the last 2 weeks or so, I mean, I fly the Zibo for work. I don't fly it for entertainment. You know?
Yeah, well, you're doing test flights of every new variant that Zibo pumps out, and he needs people to do that, right? I mean, I know some of the other guys that are in the testing group, you know, but you need somebody who can give him feedback on every change and knows what's going on. And you doing that is a very important part of that process.
Yeah.
So
I'm loving it. It's nice. Nice doing it.
yeah, I'm happy to see you do it.
Good.
And I just wish I had more time to follow your test flights. It's just it doesn't. Obviously, we're in different parts of the world, so
Yeah, time zone.
schedule has a lot to do with time of day, right?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Well, Twkster, thanks again for coming. Guys, do you have any questions for him before he goes? Anybody?
No, that was fabulous. Thank you very much.
No question for you. Thank you.
Thanks, Twkster.
all right.
I got one.
Okay.
Very, very informative inside view. Thank you, Twkster.
Mikma, you need to bring your mic closer so we can hear you.
I said thank you, Twkster. Very informative.
Not you, Mikma.
Well,
He's trying to speak and everybody
everybody's
talks over him.
welcome. Everybody's welcome.
Which two airports, Twkster?
I'm sorry, did I say that again? Oh, you mean for my testing that I was talking about, a short route that I do? For me, and this is just there's no special reason for the airports in particular, but I use either Oakland International to Santa Barbara, and then Santa Barbara back to Oakland, or Santa Barbara back to San Francisco, SFO. And, they're short flights, 35 minutes, 40 minutes, whatever. But I use specific departures and arrivals. In particular, going into Santa Barbara, there's an arrival that changes all the time, and I use that. Or it doesn't change all the time, but it tests a lot of the autopilot.
Twkster, Mikma's got a question for you. I think it's Mikma, but his mic was a bit soft, so we spoke over him. Can you go, Mikma? What's your question? Is it you?
Yes, for Twkster, when your training videos will come online, will there be announcements somewhere?
Yeah, I will. As a matter of fact, I'll probably, the smartest thing to do here is to use Discord and to, work with, the Skymatix team. And I think that that's probably a good place. At some point, we will get into a discussion about how to best do that. I could drop everything and do a video today. And it probably wouldn't take me that to not, but once I start putting them out, I want to start putting the videos out with some level of continuity time-wise. And so my anticipation is it'll be sometime after the first of the year, probably in January. But to be fair, a lot of this also in the past has been determined by my own flying schedule. I still fly for a living. And up until very recently, I was flying for an operator where I work 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off. Well, during the 2 weeks on, I'm not home, obviously, and it's very difficult for me to do anything online consistently. That leaves me my 2 weeks at home, which in the past year and a half has been very focused on building my my home simulator, which is based on the Zibo mod. So, but yeah, I'll be making an announcement when I put the first one out. And I already have a few videos out that deal with basics like weight and balance. Some of you may already be aware of that one. There's a Zibo mod weight and balance video on YouTube you can watch if you haven't seen it yet. But it talks about stability and all this stuff too. So
Great, I'll be looking forward for those.
You're welcome.
Awesome. I'm just looking for that video quickly. Zibo.
Thank you, Twkster, by the way. That was really, really interesting.
You're welcome.
Got it.
I'm a little sorry that I don't get involved a little bit more often because I know you've grown quite a group here, and it's probably the place to go to. It most definitely is the place to go to when you need to learn something about Zibo and all those people. I'm amazed. I have no idea, and I just wanted to ask. I've never asked Zibo this self. How many downloads? How many people does he have that's downloading the aircraft now?
Oh, it's difficult to
with
say.
each update?
It's not actually measurable because he's got his Google Drive, I've got my Google Drive, and then we've got the torrents. Okay, and there's no counter on any of them. It's very difficult to say. Huh?
Yeah, it's it's just interesting, how many users we have out there now, because obviously in the first year, we're there you could count the number of users in less than 100 or two, and then it grew and it grew and it grew. So it'd be interesting to see where it's at now as it continues to gain in notoriety and popularity. Just that it's up to.
The only thing I can say is it's the most flown aircraft in X-plane.
Yeah, according to their stats, the last ones we saw.
Yes. Yes.
Well, that tells you a lot right there,
Yeah.
And those stats right there. If we look at Laminar's stats on which aircraft are being flown periodically, then that gives a pretty good idea how it's growing. I know there's a lot of people that probably download it, try it once, and then because it's it may be something that they don't want to go in depth into, so they don't end up flying it much, and they go back to something a little more basic. I'm sure there's a number of those people, but
I also think it speaks massively of the relationship of Laminar needs Zibo, Zibo needs Laminar.
Exactly, and I there was a time there when Laminar didn't seem to be admitting that too much, but and that's not a criticism; it's just the way things are, But yes, indeed, the Zibo mod is all about laminar flow. It's all about the laminar and X-plane, and we are all here because we love X-plane. X-plane is not perfect, but it's still, in my opinion, the most accurate. I'll give you an example of why I consider X-plane superior to Microsoft when it comes to flight dynamics. If you go into Plane Maker, which is only partially used in Zibo mod now, as Zibo has continued to develop an independent flight model external to the Laminar Plane Maker. But if you go into Plane Maker, you can model an aircraft after real flight dynamics models. All of the airfoils for the Zibo mod were developed using Airfoil Maker, and they're not just a bunch of numbers that we plugged in, from some wind tunnel test that some college student did, and then they published, and then somebody used them in their aircraft flight model and said, okay, I've got the most accurate flight model because it's wind test or wind tunnel tests, right? And that never usually doesn't prove to be true. But we can look at changes that have to happen. You build an airfoil, you put it in the airplane, you go test fly it. It doesn't fly exactly how you intended. So you record the data and you go back and you make modifications to the airfoil based on real aerodynamic principles, and it works. That is the real key to what makes X-plane unique. With their blade element theory or whatever they call it, the reality of it is it actually is using fairly realistic flight dynamics and atmospheric physics. And they're not perfect, but they're going in the right direction rather than using, I forget what the term we used to use is, but anyway, when you did a flight model in MSFS, or to be honest, the real Boeing flight model that they use in the simulators uses similar technology to what you're flying in MSFS, believe it or not. It's just a little more sophisticated.
Based. Yeah, it's all table based. If this, then that kind of a thing. So under this condition, that's what you want, and then, but it's all fixed kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. It's if, thens, and wherefore. It's programming, but we can actually take it a little bit higher programming level with PlaneMaker, and we can tell it what kind of characteristics we want, put the inputs in there, and then we get the responses. Sometimes they don't work the way we want, but usually that's because we forgot something else. Some other element was not taken into account, and it's, there are thousands and thousands of variables in the real world, right? I should say millions. So, actually trying to model that, it's never going to be perfect, but the more Laminar has stayed consistently wanting to make sure they develop the most accurate airspace and flight modeling, I should say, aerodynamics, is, that has been a key to how you can develop an aircraft that actually acts correctly. Now, a good example of that is they're not perfect, but they're trying to improve constantly. A good example is that originally most of the flight models in Laminar, drag was all based on, frontal drag and lift drag, on the airfoils. But the airframes themselves, the fuselage, was not modeled as a airfoil. And that is only recently that Laminar is starting to address this in the last, year and a half or something. But they suddenly realized themselves there's a big part of the puzzle that was missing. And that's one of the reasons why originally we had, thinking back, we don't remember how difficult it was to create an aircraft with proper yaw stability. Well, that was mostly because the fuselage model that was being used was non-existent. The flight model only saw the rudder hanging out there. It didn't see a fuselage. So when the wind shifted, you didn't get any forces acting on the fuselage itself. Well, that's one of the things in Zibo mod that we do, and I think we do it better than Laminar, in that we're using an actual fuselage model that is an aerodynamic model. It's airfoils. It's not pretty. I had to do some, because Laminar doesn't provide the tools, so I had to create one on my own using a very primitive technique, but it worked. And so when we fly the Zibo mod, right, when the winds shift, right, it's finding that, I was talking about the center of forces before, and the center of gravity, and how all those things work together. If you have the wind shift suddenly to the side, if you think about it, right, the wind is going to be pushing on that fuselage as well as the tail. If you don't have an aerodynamic, or if you don't have an airfoil as the fuselage, then the fuselage does not feel those forces. But what it does see is the tail, that big rudder sticking up there. And so it pushes on that rudder. And that's why we had so much trouble in the past with trying to keep it stable in shifting winds, right, as the airplane would yaw from side to side. And it was all because there was no counterbalance force on the fuselage itself, right? In other words, if the wind is pushing on the side of the fuselage, right, behind the wing, it's also pushing it on the front, in front of the wing. And with careful modeling, you can reduce that yawing tendency just because you get a balanced dynamic force on the fuselage. Fuselage is also a lifting body, right? I don't hear people ask about that very often, but why does the Boeing in level flight at cruise with the nose at 2.5 degrees nose up? Well, it does that because the fuselage is a lifting body, and it contributes some lift without creating too much drag. That 2.5 degrees is pretty common to most jet airplanes. Intuitively, we'd think that level flight and nose should be perfectly level to create the minimum amount of drag, but it's not true because we don't get any lift out of that. So, this is another thing that the Zibo mod uses fuselage lift, although not very much. It uses fuselage lift to contribute to the overall flight dynamics. And that affects stability as well as, cruise characteristics. And, we're still working on, obviously, until they get Laminar gets the weather model worked out. I know they're improving it. But as we all know, we still got problems with shifting winds. And, you know, I'm probably a little bit remiss that I don't, you know, go directly to Laminar and try and engage with them on this. But it just hasn't been my style, unfortunately. But, you know, I mean, if they just change wind shifts so that they happen over time rather than instantaneously, most of the problems that we see would go away. So
that's fascinating. And you know what? Us guys here, this side, we don't know these things, and we don't have, you know, the know-how, I suppose. I don't, to go and find these things, to know the difference and all. So we are totally dependent on guys like you to go find this and to figure it out. I wouldn't know where to go look for this.
You know, I'm not an aerodynamic engineer. I don't have that kind of training. But, you know, from flying large aircraft, jets in particular, for, you know, several decades now, obviously you're exposed to, you know, proper flight dynamics, you know, how they work, because in real life you experience it. Now, whether or not you're able to absorb that information in a way that's useful, you know, everybody has different skill sets. And but for me, it's always been something that I was able to turn around and regurgitate in another form. In other words, I know how flight controls work. I know how airfoils work. I know how the fuselage. I really understand center of gravity and how the CG shift works and how that affects the different flight dynamics of an aircraft. So all I have to do is take that knowledge I learned in real life and figure out how I can plug it into X-Plane. Sometimes they give us good tools for that. Sometimes they don't. One of the reasons why Zibo Mod has grown well past the tools that Laminar gives us is because Zibo's desire to get that extra level of accuracy that the modeling tools that are available in Laminar just can't do yet. That doesn't mean they won't. Someday they probably will. But we know that they're continuing to try and fix the engine model, for instance. Another one is, you know, trying to find the balance. When you're doing aerodynamic design, you know, to get the aircraft to fly like a real airplane as much as possible, there are certain basics that you have to start with, or you end up going off down the wrong, kind of like we would say, down a rabbit hole, right? And one of those things is, the very first thing is, how much drag does the aircraft have? Well, I tell you what, you can look all over the internet. You can search everywhere, but to find the total drag of the 737NG, right, in cruise flight, there's not a lot of information out there. So you're left with a guessing game. Well, if you don't get that number right, then everything else will be wrong, right? You can tune to adjust for anomalous drag information, but the problem is, at various parts of the flight envelope, it's going to come out and it's going to show its ugly face as being problematic because you didn't tune the drag correctly. Now the thrust is wrong. Now your lift curves are wrong. I mean, you can go on and on and on. So that's one of the hardest things to model is what's the total drag of the aircraft. It doesn't matter what the drag of an airfoil is. It matters what the whole entity, the whole aircraft produces. And to get that correct is a starting point. We've gotten really lucky, and I'll tell you, we went through several iterations with Zibo Mod before I was fortunate to literally stumble onto the information that I needed, and I didn't even realize that was the tool. And what I used is, there's some published data that compares several different jet aircraft at high altitude cruise, and what they were used at 40,000 feet, for instance, how much thrust is required, what's the fuel burn, all right? What they didn't give us was the weight of the aircraft. But that, pardon me, by itself was not that important. But I could look at that, and then I knew that the amount of thrust required is directly relative to the amount of drag. So if they published the thrust, which they did for a -7 engine, at this particular speed, and they were using Mach 0.80, for instance, that I could then take that and re-engineer it, back-engineer it, and put it into the Zibo. And so what we've got now is we've got the drag profile. It may not be perfect, but I tell you, in my opinion, it's 99%, because now the airplane will perform predictably during climb, during descent, during cruise. The only other thing that is the variable then is obviously, well, it's not the only thing, but the big one is getting the thrust right, like descent thrust, and when it's at idle, how much thrust is the engine producing as we're coming down at a cruise altitude down to low level, right? So the engine is actually producing thrust. If it's not very efficient, it may be having negative thrust, and that's what we used to see in early variants of X-plane, is you put the engines to idle in these jets and they were making negative thrust. Well, that was a problem with trying to get a proper descent profile. So we tuned the drag and the lift, but then the final thing is Zibo setting the idle thrust just right in his own engine model that he created in C++.
I've got a question. I've got a short. Sorry.
Go ahead.
Go on.
I've got a short question. How do you reckon with that improvement of drag with those winglets as well?
To be honest, that change in drag with the winglets is so small that we have not pursued it to that level yet. That doesn't mean that we won't at some point. But I'll tell you what, I spent, to be honest about this, I spent hundreds, I haven't got near the amount of development time in this as Zibo does, but some years back, before 2018, or actually during 2017, 2018, I was living in Shanghai, China. And I was flying an airplane over there, but we only flew once or twice a month. So all the rest of the time, I was sitting at my desk in my apartment, and I was working on Zibo. And I spent, I'd spend 50, 60 hours a week just working on flight modeling at that time. And one of my things that I wanted to do was create the most accurate performance model. I wanted to be able to open the Boeing performance charts and get, not perfect, my goal was to be within 2%. Believe it or not, Boeing allows 3% error, but would be within 2% of the Boeing numbers that are published in the book. At a particular weight, certain altitude, at a certain Mach number, what's the fuel flow going to be? What are the N1s going to be? Like that. And you have no idea how many hundreds and hundreds of hours I spent on that. But you know what? In all of the 7.5 years that I've been involved with the project, or 7 years plus, I've never had one user come up to me and say, hey, these numbers in the book don't exactly match the Zibo. Why not? It's because that's not where people's interests are as users. They do care how much fuel it burns, but I've yet to find one of them come up to me and say, hey, I was checking the performance charts and there's an error here or an error there. We see this sometimes in takeoff and landing data. But I guess where you're getting at is, invest your time in development where it is most profitable.
Yeah, of course.
And I found the hard way that my own desires of accuracy, now that's not to say they're not important. Ultimately, both Zibo and I are committed to try and make the airplane perform as accurately and close to the real airplane as possible. I did some landing tests yesterday, and I was amazed, how closely the airplane performed on landing distance on a wet runway. And it's one of the reasons I use Santa Barbara. It's got like a little over a 6,000-foot runway. So if I make the airplane heavy and I make the runway wet, it's going to be a challenge, if you don't do it right. So, to get it as close to the real data as possible. But when it comes to these cruise numbers, originally we found that the laminar engine model just wasn't accurate enough. No matter what we did, no matter what kind of oddball, we tried everything working outside the box to try and make the laminar engine model work. And it does a generally okay job, except when you're trying to exactly model characteristics of the real aircraft. And that's a tall order. And so that's why Zibo redeveloped the engine model on his own, so he would have more control over tuning it. Now again, in order to get it accurate, it means hours and hours, hundreds of hours, quite literally, of testing and recording data, and then comparing that to the real data, and then making adjustments and going and doing it all over again. And it's I can get it at one altitude, for instance, I can get the numbers perfect. But then maybe that, say, is 35,000 feet. And then we do a different weight at a different altitude. And will we be perfect? No, will it be somewhere else in the envelope? And this is one of the limitations that we had with the laminar model, is that we could generalize the curve for engine performance because it doesn't allow me to customize the engine performance curve completely across altitudes and thrust. It uses for lack of a better word, a bipolar adjustment that cannot be. You can tune it on the bottom, you can tune it on the top, and then it'll all of that data will pivot around a central point in the middle of the flight model. Whereas you couldn't have like 3 unique places where I could adjust it, which is what I really needed to get as close to accurate to the real airplane as possible. So I kind of got off on that a little bit. Did I answer your question, or I get too far off?
Yeah. The influence is so the difference is so small with those winglets.
It is. It's a very small. It is less.
It's perhaps
Boeing
1% max.
Yeah. Boeing says that and it's not really. Where does Boeing get their data from? They got it from. I'm trying to remember the name of the company.
Aero.
That produces the winglets. Aeroflow or Aero.
Yeah, Aero. It's called Aero.
Yeah. Well, they put out data that says that you should be able to get 3% improvement, and if you're flying the airplane at optimal LRC, you should be able to get up to 5%. Well, that's typical marketing. It's a little bit.
It's in practice. It's not even 1%, I think.
Yeah, and so on average, you're right. You're going to get maybe 1, or if you're very fortunate, you might get 1.5%. Part of this is going to have to do with, the individual airline that's operating it, and do they use their data properly? We all talk about setting the proper index for flying the airplane. Well, all of this stuff, these are variables that have to be tuned. When I tune the flight model, I don't use any of that. What I use is the Boeing charts. And the Boeing charts, for instance, use very specific numbers for climb and descent. The basic number for tuning the flight model is you climb the airplane at 250 to 10, 280 knots to Mach 0.78. All right. And that, of course, is a constant. Now, is that optimum? Not necessarily, but it's a constant that I can measure against. When we do the descent, it's the same thing. You use a constant descent profile, 320 knots to, Mach 0.78 to 320 knots. I have to go back and look, to be honest, which ones I use, because there's a couple of them. But the bottom line is I'm using constant data that's smack in the middle of what Boeing publishes in their charts. And then you can measure the results from that. If I'm using, these efficiency variables that are built into the flight management system, i.e. to change the climb profile based on weight, temperature, all of these different variables that try to smooth out the efficiency, I don't have anything consistent to work with. But if I'm shooting for data that is right in the middle of what Boeing publishes, i.e. using a constant climb or descent profile, or cruising the airplane, for instance, when I'm trying to model, or in the past when I've tried to model cruise performance, I use two things.
Fuel mileage improvements.
Yeah. I model at 0.78 Mach and I model at LRC. Two very different flight regimes, because 0.78 Mach is constant speed, variable angle of attack, whereas LRC is constant angle of attack, variable airspeed. They are two opposites to each other. But you want to look at both of those. And if you only looked at LRC, for instance, the problem with that was you'd only be looking at one angle of attack optimally, and you might get the kind of performance that you're looking through at different altitudes at LRC and think, wow, I did a good job. But then you go to fly the airplane at, say, 0.78 Mach, and all of a sudden everything changes, because now you've got variable angles of attack, which you didn't address originally, because you have to, the curve of the airfoil, i.e. how much center, the coefficient of lift and the coefficient of drag is variable over various angle of attacks. So when you go to model the airfoil, if you don't test through all those various angle of attacks, to be honest, I'm not gonna model it for, extreme angles of attack, because that's not the way we fly airliners. We fly 98% of the time, the airliner is flown with somewhere between 2 and 8 degrees of angle attack, for instance. And so it's very rare that unless we're doing stall testing or something like that, that we're going to end up at 10, 12 degrees angle of attack on purpose, right? Only when we're about to escape the envelope, so to speak, are we otherwise going to be in that mode. So, I basically model the the airfoils within a very small area, and I focus on between 0 and 5 degrees angle of attack is where I do most of the modeling. The rest of it is more of an elbow, because we're not actually flying the airplane in that particular mode of operation, unless we're, like I say, practicing stalls. But that's a different issue that has to be addressed as well. So, but when you've got just the air, if anybody who's looked into the airfoil section, you see a whole bunch of airfoils in there. Some of them are used and some of them are not. Some of them are in there just because they give us an option if we need to make a change to address a problem and resolve an issue. But about half of the airfoils you find in the airfoil section are actually used. And to be honest, I've never counted them myself, how many airfoils I created, but you've got unique airfoils for each surface on the aircraft, as well as, like I said, we've got airfoils that model the fuselage, which is still, I think, to this day, unique. Laminar has not shared a lot of information. If anybody's seen it, then pass it along, but Laminar's not shared a lot of information about how they have done their fuselage modeling change. Where they went to, remember we went to the experimental flight model, right? That was all about the experimental fuselage. Well, the problem I found right away with it is I couldn't tune the drag on it. So if I couldn't tune the drag on it, I couldn't get accurate flight model, no matter how hard I tried. So we had to get rid of that. And you don't want to have to do that, but we did. So we started with our own. When we came to X-Plane 12, there were more changes that were made because they decided to change how they modeled Mach compression, Mach drag. And the way it had been handled previously was no longer handled that way. So now we had to redesign our flight model to accommodate that. And the new way is probably the more accurate way, but for anybody dragging a flight model from X-Plane 11 to X-Plane 12, it obviously gets them starting from scratch for if you're looking for anything resembling accuracy. So before we were having to do more workarounds, we just had to change to a different methodology on how we modeled Mach compression. And that's the final thing I was talking about. When you talk about accurate performance at altitude, say you're cruising at 35,000 feet at optimum weight, if I'm at LRC, it's one thing, but if I want to cruise at Mach 0.78, for instance, or 7.9, then I'm going to have much higher drag profile that's induced by Mach. And as we start to get a shock wave buildup on the wing, and then that's where it gets really finite on how to tune it to get accurate performance. It's getting that last 1 or 2% we were talking about. So the winglets, someday we may address that uniquely, but right now the flight model is addressed to use winglets. But if you use, one without winglets, or you use one with the new scimitars, the changes are small enough that it's not going to be noticed unless you're somebody who's really, really chasing those numbers using a performance manual.
That actually answered the question.
Yeah,
for
all
me
clear.
Too.
Yeah. Completely clear.
Yeah. A couple of
I
people have
probably
asked
gave
me.
you too much information.
Yeah, no,
That was probably more information you need.
in fuel consumption, it takes a lot, or maybe also 1% or something.
Yeah, that's the derivative of all that, right?
Yeah.
If you don't have accurate climb performance, and cruise performance and descent performance, this is something that we have to go back and look at again. We used to have, and those who flew the Zibo mod during the X-Plane 11 version, in particular, in later variants of it, it actually had more accurate fuel flow than it does, or total burn than it does right now. And part of that reason is that Zibo and I have not had the chance to work together to collect the data that we need so that he can plug it into the flight. It used to be I could tune the engine model. I cannot. All right. I can't do what Zibo does. I'm not a programmer. So I can't go into his code and tweak his code in order to tune it. It would be nice. It's just not going to happen because I'm not a programmer. So I have to give data to Zibo that he can use in order to fine-tune our specific fuel consumption. And that is the key right there. Because a jet engine's specific fuel consumption is variable. It changes depending on altitude, airspeed, and thrust setting that you're using.
And
Low
age
versus
of
high.
engines as well.
Yeah, it's very, and that's one of the reasons why, tuning for LRC is very different than tuning for high speed flight, i.e. you want to go Mach 7.9, for instance, versus LRC, which at that particular weight might be Mach 0.73. And the two are going to act very different because the amount of thrust you're demanding from the engine, and you're in a different speed regime. Jet engines operate most efficiently at high speed. When if the throttle is maxed out within its ITT limits, in theory anyway, that's when they produce the most efficient operation. So in order to do that at high altitude, you've got to really be having that engine scream, so to speak. The N2 turbine is operating at very high speeds. And that's necessary in order to compress the air up there because, you've only got, at say 40,000 feet, the air density is only about 18% of sea level. So, it's having to really push a lot of air through that engine. That's for two reasons: to produce the thrust, but the other one is to get the best, and I hate to use this term, but it's still true in a jet, but to get the best stoichiometric mixture for the fuel burn. So that only happens within certain compression ratios. Same thing happens with idle. When we pull the engine to idle, unless we're paying attention to it, we don't notice that, or for many of us don't notice anyway, that when you pull the engine to idle at 39,000 feet, for instance, it's got a different idle RPM than it does when you're at 5,000 feet.
Yeah, of course.
Well, that's for the same reasons I'm talking about here. If I pull the engine to idle and I had the same idle settings as I did at 5,000 feet, and I pull that engine to idle at 39,000 feet, there's about a 99% chance it's going to flame out.
Yes.
Because it cannot produce the proper combustion with such a low density when I decelerate the airplane to idle speed. I need a higher idle speed in order to have enough compression running through that system, to get the proper combustion ratio in the combustor to be able to sustain a flame. So almost all jet engines do the same thing. At high altitude, the higher you go, the higher the idle RPM is. A lot of real line pilots don't even notice this, themselves, because it's not something we pay attention to. If I ask the average guy flying a 737 today, what's the idle at 35,000 feet, there'd just be a question mark. And that's no through fault. It's not something they focus on, right? So it's not something that they would be paying attention to. But this is something we had to iterate over time, to find, a fairly close to as accurate. Now, is there a chart out there? There might be. Maybe Pratt & Whitney's got a chart out there, that can show me exactly what the idle is at every altitude.
The engine manufacturers have.
Yeah,
definitely.
but I certainly haven't found it.
But
what we can do is
the other thing is maintaining bleed air pressures and so forth as well.
Exactly, So these are all balancing act in the real engine, right? How much RPM is required, like you say, not just to keep the engine running, but will it actually put out enough bleed air so that we have utility, i.e., keeping the cabin pressurized, and things like that. So in a lot of jet airplanes, if you pull the engine to idle and you want to use the engine anti-ice, for instance, you may not have enough bleed air, and you have a minimum idle. Like I fly I fly a business jet right now that it's a Falcon 2000, and that engine that is on that one, when I turn on the engine anti-ice, a couple of amber arcs pull up on my N1s right away, and I have to push the throttles up to set that minimum N1 in order to have effective engine and wing anti-ice. If I turn the wing anti-ice is where this actually happens. The engines are okay at idle for the most part, but if I have the wing anti-ice on, then I need that minimum RPM in order to actually keep the wings anti-iced. And if I don't pay attention to that, just keep them at idle and have the wing anti-ice on, I'm fat, dumb, and happy, so to speak, because I might be building ice up, and I just don't realize it yet. So, but this is, like you say, bleed air for pressurization, for anti-ice, and also just normal operation. Some of the things some of the mechanisms that make the engine work correctly, for instance, a lot of people don't realize that when I have an engine at max thrust and then I pull it all the way to idle, the first thing that would happen in a primitive jet engine is it would tend to want to go into a compressor stall, because you just backed up the engine, so to speak, by deflating the RPM to idle, and you've got all of this massive air coming in through the engine, at high speed, and now we've just kind of blocked it off, and that tends to create compressor stalls, which are not good for an engine. It's kind of like belching the air back out through the front of the engine. It does terrible things to turbine blades and compressor blades and things like that.
Yeah.
So
you won't do that normally, yeah.
Yeah. So two things we can use with that. We can have what we call variable guide vanes in the inlet of the engine that change their angle of attack to adjust for the changes in airflow. And then the other one is when you pull the thrust back suddenly, we'll have a bleed valve that'll open and dump that excess air pressure off the compressor. And the combination of the two of those usually gets the job done. Today, it's all automatic and controlled by the EEC, the electronic engine controls, which have different names in different airplanes, but all basically the same, just a computer to make sure everything's optimized. In the older engine,
they damp those movements out.
What's that?
They damp those movements out, so it won't go idle right away.
Yeah, it'll manage the whole process, like you're saying. So you don't run into problems with things like compressor stalls like we used to. And then the older engines, they were all mechanical. The fuel control did all these things, but it did it in a very mechanical analog way. And sometimes it just wasn't right if it wasn't properly adjusted. And so, you could end up with some big problems with compressor stalls, and it actually damaged the engine. But I haven't seen a compressor stall in, 20 years. I'm not saying they don't happen, but not in anything I've been flying recently. So, but these are all things that, how do we model them in the simulator, and do we need to model them in the simulator? It's not like we can go out there and disassemble our engine on the line, and to replace components, but who knows, maybe that day will come too. I don't know. You have starter failure, you can go out and model removing and replacing your starter. That would be a pretty advanced level of simulation, but such as it is. Anyway, you can see there's some challenges to it, and we're aware of them. It's easy to be advertising all the time that you've got the best flight model and you've got the best this and the best systems and that and the other. Marketing is not always accurate, right? But there is no marketing going on with Zibo because it's not a commercial product. And Zibo cares about the accuracy deep in his heart.
A lot,
And,
yeah.
So
makes a big difference.
So it's one thing to beat our chest about how good it is, but if you're going to do that, make sure we're doing it for the right reasons and that we're not just putting out propaganda.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I tell you what, Twkster, with all the guys we have here on Discord, all the real pilots, all the actual testers, and the guys sitting here with us, I think we are terribly committed ourselves. We take this whole story very seriously. We're not joking around. For us, this is part of our life. So we do take the Zibo mod and what you guys do very seriously, and also what we do very seriously.
To go back briefly to one thing you were talking about, N1 speeds at different stages of the flight. We have a very experienced pilot who joins us and puts some of us through the mill, and he will quote N1 figures for particular points at a stage in flight, and he is impressed with how close Zibo gets to those figures.
And I tell you,
Twkster knows that guy, doesn't he?
I think he probably does. I'm not going to mention names here because we're on.
Yeah, I think I think I might have watched one or two of his videos, and if it's the same person I'm thinking of, he did a very accurate assessment of our engine outperformance, and that is something that it's another level up, to be able to get asymmetric handling correct, to get the performance correct. How much rudder do I need? Blah blah blah. All of these things, and we spent a lot of time on. Again, if the flight model, the basic flight model, is correct, it makes it a lot easier to attain those results, because then it's a small tuning thing instead of a major overhaul, so to speak. And believe me, we went through a lot of changes over time trying to get, because as everybody knows, yaw stability is really important when you pull an engine back. If the flight model doesn't perform correctly in yaw stability, there's no way that I can model the engine out handling correctly. And of course, I won't say the only, for the most part, the ones that are going to appreciate that are going to be the real pilots who fly the airplanes, and they know what to look for. They know what they should be seeing. They know that if they push the rudder in and center the ball and the yoke comes to level and the airplane's flying level and it's going straight ahead, it's performing correctly, they can see it right away. Whereas, for most simmers, unless they have that practical experience from the real world to draw on, they're not necessarily going to be sure that what they're seeing is what is correct, right? So there'll always be the question mark in their mind: is this really the way it's supposed to be? Well, they told me it was. But to have somebody who's got genuine experience in the airplane come and give you feedback is absolutely invariable. It's invaluable. It's
Absolutely.
it's really the important part of the equation. There are some things that in the very, very beginning, stability was such a problem, right? I mean, anybody who tried to do a crosswind takeoff and landing back in the earlier days of X-Plane 11, it was, a wild ride at best, because these flight models were not performing accurately. And like I say, in the Zibo, we canceled about 85 or 90% of that. Well, it's hard to put a percentage on it, but you get my drift. When I went to modeling a fuselage, rather than not having a fuselage model, suddenly things changed dramatically. So I was able to tune for accurate results.
I'm glad you did,
So-
Twkster. No, I'm glad you did that. It's amazing to fly it now.
Well, I say the more you hand fly, the more I think that I'll be honest about something. I very much care about accuracy for simmers overall. But my goal has always been to reach a level of accuracy in the way the aircraft flies, so that pilots who actually fly it for a living can use it as a tool.
Yeah.
Because if it's not accurate, then it's negative. It's negative feedback, negative learning.
Yeah.
If you're trying to practice using a tool that doesn't perform like the real airplane will.
Yeah.
And so getting as close to that as we possibly can, that obviously is limited by a whole bunch of factors when it comes to, what tool sets you have to work with as a simmer. If you don't have a good yoke and or, throttle quadrant and an excellent set of rudder pedals, that's the starting point for me in getting accurate handling. Because otherwise, just leave it on the autopilot. Because, a twist yoke or a twist stick, even a really good one, just isn't going to model the way the airplane's supposed to handle. And try and do a crosswind landing with a twist stick is really tough, right?
Yeah, the pilot Mac was talking about, he does that regularly. Huh? He calls it cowboy flying.
Yeah.
And then
Yeah.
he does it with 40 knots wind and 30 gusting and so on.
Well, I tell you, in the real world, in real life, and I think a lot of times in desktop simming we don't appreciate this. The consequences are very high, right? You got an aircraft with 150 plus passengers in the back, and you've got a really stiff, gusty crosswind landing you have to make. The consequences of failure are not acceptable. So, obviously, it's a very important aspect of trying to model the simulator to give us the kind of feedback that we can use in the real airplane. The only thing we don't have to work with, of course, is motion, right? We don't have those motion feedbacks that are part of it, but they're not all of it. But if the aircraft is performing correctly, i.e. how much rudder does it take, how much aileron into the wind, and what'll happen if I put too much aileron and the spoilers kick up, all of that has to be adjusted for in the flight modeling in order to get good crosswind characteristics. And we went through several iterations of the flight model, and part of that had to do with Laminar improving the flight dynamics of the sim itself, right? The atmospherics had to improve. But
talking about the devil.
Yeah, they're still working on that, right?
I was just saying, talking about the devil.
The person we spoke of has just joined us in Discord.
Oh, okay. Oh, well, welcome.
Oh, stop talking about him.
Hello.
Hi.
Good
Hello.
evening. Good evening, Sasso.
How's it going?
All
Oh,
good in
nice.
you?
We've
Well,
just been praising your skills and how much you appreciated Twkster's flight modeling work.
oh, absolutely. I'm in love with that.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, by all means, nice to meet you, Sasso. This is Tim, Twkster.
It's a pleasure. It's my pleasure. Absolutely. I'm still waiting the computer, believe or not. So I'm still here waiting.
You
we'll
two
see.
nearly need to chat together because I'm sure that you both Sasso and Twkster can give feedback and input to each other. So
Yeah, I always appreciate that feedback. The more direct feedback I can get, the
Yeah.
easier it is when I flight model. And to be very honest, a lot of times it's hard to get data back from people that's based on something that's measurable.
just to be
And-
aware, Sasso, we're currently still on stream, so don't say anything you want to go out into the wider world.
Yeah, no problem.
But it has been always part of the challenge. Just to make something clear for those guys that are on line right now. Sometimes there's a misimpression that's out there, and it certainly wasn't circulated by me. But I have never flown the Boeing 737. I'm not an NG rated pilot.
Me neither.
I flew
No idea.
other Boeing
He
products.
lies a bit.
Right? I flew other Boeing products. I flew the Boeing 727.
Yeah.
And I flew the Boeing 747. Now, there's differences, obviously, between just those two airplanes, but when you throw the 737, the NG in particular, into the mix, there are difference in handling characteristics that are kind of a mix of the two. You know, the 727,
Absolutely.
the 727 was a pilot's dream to fly. It was a point-and-shoot airplane. You point the nose where you want the airplane to go. If you added or thrust or reduced thrust, nothing much changed except for airspeed. It didn't tend to pitch, and you get an airplane that has underslung engines like the 737, the 747 even more so.
Yeah.
And you push the thrust up heavily at a specific speed, and then you're going to be pushing forward on that stick quite a bit to overcome the pitching moment.
Pitch to nose couple.
Yeah, and these are the things that are pretty difficult to model well in a desktop simulator because we don't have that feedback in motion, right? And G forces and things like that. And especially if you don't have a really good controller, a control yoke or something that's got the proper forces modeled, even just generally, it's really hard to reproduce it. So what we used to do is we would try to model the feeling of these forces through how much control yoke travel was required to do the job. Because psychologically, if you had to pull the stick further, the airplane felt heavier, right? Well, that's not accurate, but if it's the only tool you got, it's a tool you use. Well, we're trying to move away from that in the Zibo mod and try and get as close to the accurate modeling of, control forces and, results as possible. But we still have this handicap that, we don't have G-forces and we don't have motion. So the way it's perceived, a good instrument pilot knows the difference. And that's one thing that, like Sasso, all right, when you're a real pilot, you can look at the attitude indicator, and I'm sure he will agree. The attitude indicator tells me 90% of what I need to know. Right?
Absolutely.
That's my control instrument. And then when I look at my engine thrust, right?
That's it.
That's
Pitch
my other
plus
control
thrust.
instrument.
The pitch
So
and
pitch
thrust
plus
give
power.
you
Yeah.
pitch plus thrust give you a performance.
Exactly.
That's all you need.
All right? So all the other instruments, performance instruments. So the ADI, the pitch and roll, and thrust, those are our main control instruments. Once we understand how that works and how that feeds back into the airplane when we make changes, surprisingly, the brain transfers a lot of that information.
Oh, absolutely.
And
It's when
puts
I
it into the
say
same.
to stay ahead of the stay ahead of the aircraft is when you do
Exactly.
even a raw data flying, or when you do something. Basically, many times to the people here I said the autopilot is something stupid. The autopilot is not doing anything magic. So if you understand that, see, it's you at the end controlling the autopilot by the input given from the MCP, then you will understand the logic behind these aircraft. And in terms of flying, if you do a raw data flying, it's basically the same thing. It's the same principle at the end, but the workload
Exactly.
it's a lot more.
When I'm in the real airplane in the simulator, and I don't care which airplane I'm in at that particular time, right? Or as far as which jet that I happen to be flying at that point in time. When I do steep turns and stalls, I do them with the flight director off.
Yeah.
Because I want to feel the airplane, the forces on the stick, you know, and I don't even trim the airplane in a steep turn. I mean, I could do that in the 7.4, I could do it in any airplane.
Boeing suggests. The flight crew training manual says that for steep turn and approach to stall, but mainly for the steep turn, you have to do it in raw data flying. So autopilot, auto throttle off, and flight director switches off. For the approach to stall, you can do it with the autopilot because you want to train the pilots to go beyond flight director indication.
Yes.
So it's the same principle at the end.
And that's something that we need to recommend more often. That that the FCTM is one of the manuals that people want to read, not just the.
Yeah, it depends which kind of simulation you want to do. If
push
you
buttons
are
or fly.
a sim, exactly, the pushing button simmer is fine, and it's wonderful in the Zibo because if you push the wrong button or if you push the correct button in the wrong order, then the aircraft is not gonna do what you are expecting. So this is exactly how it will be in the reality. As well, if you want to do a bit more of a practice in terms of raw data, in terms of raw data ILS, and so on, while still the Zibo, you can do it. And you can use those pitch plus thrust. And this will give you the performance.
Well, exactly, and
we reduce your workload a lot.
If you were in the real simulator, for instance, and you were going to go do a steep turn, right? You know that there's a preset because you use training weights, right?
Yeah.
You know there's a preset thrust that gets the job done. And ideally, that preset thrust should be very close in the Zibo to what you have in the real simulator.
Yeah.
Because otherwise, when you practice the steep turn and preset your thrust here, you're not going to get the same result you'd get. That would be negative training, right?
Yeah.
So that's.
But then the thing is that you have to teach to the people during the simulator session, or especially to the simmer pilot that pretend to know, that you have to explain that the pitch and thrust are linked to the weight of the aircraft. So if you load up the airplane at 77 tons, you cannot expect the same value to work out as if you are on a 60 tons aircraft. All these small bits and pieces, simmer will not think about this. And they will say, no, the Zibo is wrong. The Zibo is not wrong. But if you use the 60 tons pitch and thrust value, then you cannot use the same one for 77 tons aircraft.
Yeah, exactly.
It's simple how it works.
Over the period of time, you get sometimes comments. People will say, well, I saw a video and the video did X and yet Zibo does Y. And I say, well, first question, what was the temperature? What was the pressure altitude? Well, as takeoff, for instance, show me tell me what the predicates are for that performance before just judging it. How heavy was the aircraft? What was the temperature? What was the altitude? What flap setting was being used? All of these things, you have to know these knowns before you can evaluate what is not known. So, and that, like you say, is very important to understand all of those things. And as we were discussing earlier, I was talking to, the guys about some simple techniques, in order to learn to be comfortable with hand flying the Zibo. And it's just like we would do in real life. You've got to start with basics. So you have to start with acceleration, deceleration, speed control, altitude control.
Yeah.
Then you progress to turns. After you can manage acceleration, deceleration, and turns and do those things, then now let's do climbs and descents. And as you were talking about earlier, this is a key. And sometimes I get kickback from some people on this because they have a different philosophy. That's okay. If what they do works for them, I'm fine with it.
Absolutely, yeah.
But when I'm in the simulator, if I run into somebody who's having difficulty, I think what a lot, I'm going to set up, make a preliminary statement here. When I was teaching in the simulator, you run across pilots of various experience that come in to get a type rating. And of course, you start out with initial training. And initially, the simulator sessions work pretty much the same everywhere. It's familiarization.
Yeah.
And then we start out with basic instrument maneuvers after we've done, we were talking about steep turns, stalls, unusual attitudes. These things are usually done in the first session or so. And then the second session, we focus on, departures, arrivals, instrument approaches, right? All normal. All right. And then by that third session, that's when things get tough because now we're going to start to do some asymmetrics, right? Engine failures.
You start to fill in everything, basically.
Yeah. Engine out approach to landing, engine out miss, V1 cuts, rejected takeoffs. All of those happen in the third and fourth sessions usually. And by the time you get to the fifth or the sixth session, and we've gone off into more systems training, while at the same time continuing to do asymmetrics. So you may be having hydraulics while you're also dealing with an engine problem because you had a catastrophic failure, right? So, but these are building blocks. If a person doesn't start at the base of the building of the pyramid, i.e., can I handle the airplane?
It's like trying to build an house without starting from the bottom. This is the same thing.
Exactly. So
the problem is that you can manage to fly an aircraft from A to B using the automatics, and you can think you're good, but then if the automatics leave you alone, then you don't know what to do, basically.
Exactly.
That's the problem.
Well, I think this is one of the issues that we run into more today. And when I say what I'm about to say, it's not meant to be critical of anybody, but in the newest generation of pilots, a lot of them are brought up with glass in the airplanes they fly for basic training. 172s, they got a glass cockpit, right?
Yes.
They get used to pushing buttons. They get used to automation, and but they never had to do the brain work that's necessary to do what we used to call flying steam gauges, right? Because situational awareness with steam gauges, when you didn't have a map to fly, right, it was all done in your head.
Another workload management,
right? And so there's a different set of disciplines, right, mentally. And like you say, that one of the things I would evaluate when I have a new, lesser experienced pilot is how fast they want to jump on the AP button. Right? It doesn't say that they're wrong, because today we want pilots to use the automation.
Absolutely.
But we also want to make sure that we can fly the airplane in the event the automation fails. So, unfortunately, or I shouldn't say unfortunately, it's just the life we lived in. What is the main thing that you have to demonstrate in the simulator? You have to demonstrate, of course, that you can use the automation. You have to be able to use your tool sets. But 85% of what you're doing in a simulator, taking a type rating course to get signed off on that aircraft type, is all based on hand flying. And it's based on asymmetrics, and it's based on management.
You cannot simulate these on X-plane you know how many times I've done this in the sim with cadet, especially when I see them that they have the quick fix button, the quick finger button. What I let them engage the autopilot, which is the relief button for them. And as soon as they do it, I trick the control wheel steering. So I disable the pitch or the roll mode. And they don't realize it. They don't realize it. So they keep thinking that the aircraft is controlled by the autopilot and that's it. And then I say to them, look at your FMA. Is he fine or there is something missing? And then they start to go mad because now there is something amber blinking in front of them. You know, it's a small thing. And I understand there that they use the autopilot as a pressure relief valve, and that's not good. Because the autopilot is there to fail.
It's a normal response.
Yeah.
But all it does really, if the instructor pilot is paying attention, which isn't always the case. We know that there's good instructors and there's less than the best instructors, right? There's a variation on how much, how well the instructor is focused on the actual student performance, i.e., not just does he perform, but how can I help him to perform better? And so for me, it's been a few years since I had to teach in the simulator now, but it was always the same thing. In those first 2 sessions, I'm evaluating basically 3 things. Do they have basic hand flying skills? Do they have good situation and position awareness? And do they practice them? If all of those things, and there's varying, when you jump into a new simulator for the first time, you're not going to be performing at your best because, you're taking in all of this new information. But if I don't evaluate that in those first 2 sessions, and determine whether I need to give them a helping hand, then what happens is on the 3rd and 4th session can become, if not a disaster, it definitely come out very trying for the student who comes out of the simulator feeling beat up because he couldn't perform to the level that he himself thought he should be able to do. So if I identify basic skill deficiencies, I take a time out from the curriculum and I say, okay, we're going to do some basic pattern work here just to help you learn how to manage the aircraft, especially when you're hand flying, without being overloaded. So it's basically going back to basic instruction, but address it from a jet aircraft performance perspective rather than like we used to do in a piston single or something.
Definitely.
Right? Obviously, very big differences. Right? The differences seem small, but they're big. Right? So when it comes to predictably, flying the airplane, today we've got tool sets now in X-Plane, and largely we keep working on it, but on Zibo mod, where we can actually, as you attest, we can actually use techniques we would use in the real airplane and get positive results that reinforce what we're going to do in the simulator or in the airplane in the real world. And that's been the goal all along. We still have some challenges, no doubt, and it'll never be perfect. But we're trying, Zibo, that's his thing. He's striving for perfection as close as possible.
Yeah.
So
I'm never going to say that Zibo is perfect because we always want to be more than perfect. And there is always big room to improve.
Well, what are the areas do you think that we can, how about a little constructive criticism here? What are the areas that are most noticeable to you? Do you think we need some work, especially on the side of the house that I can have an impact? Because I can't do any programming. That's Zibo. But when it comes to flight model stuff, that's kind of my department. And I'm there to listen to any feedback you may have that you think you'd like to see improvements in.
It's been a while now since I used the scene because I moved, so it's been all of a mess for me these couple of months. generally the flight model, especially for XP12, what I remember that there was a problem with the drag curve. In other words, the thrust required was a lot more than what I would expect to have, for instance, in the cruise. But this, I think, was addressed as a problem with the weather engine or something similar. I cannot recall now exactly how the story was. But for sure, what we can do, we can have a chat once I'm able to test again the Zibo. And then we can check whatever we can do.
That's a brilliant plan.
Yeah,
Sasso,
absolutely.
Sasso,
Yeah.
yesterday and the day before, Twkster here actually updated the flight model. Zibo
Yeah,
incorporated
I read.
it. Yeah, so it's
Exactly.
going to be different to what you know it anyway. So that's
Exactly.
a brilliant plan you have there to get
Yeah,
yourself going and test.
Yeah. The changes aren't too terribly noticeable in general, and Sasso goes to fly this latest version. When he goes to hand fly it, you may see some, but mostly the changes that were made were all about control authority in the right places and stability, right? But we want that natural stability always, as I was discussing earlier with the guys, that anything that we do to artificially enhance stability is going to detract from the flighting characteristics of the aircraft. You can add in one area, but you'll have to subtract in the other if we're using artificial. But so I made some changes. That one of them was to change the point of neutral forces, because X-Plane 12 messed with that a little bit, especially in a later variant where they changed the center of gravity dynamics in the base model, in the laminar model. So, they changed the reference point.
As soon as I have the computer, then I will be able to test a bit and see what the feeling is. And then for sure we can have a chat and see.
Well, when we originally we used some examples from a typical, to be honest, using an example of a typical aircraft in the Ryanair fleet. But as you well know, in order for what we do in the weight and balance in the real weight and balance computation is I've got to start out with consistent numbers, i.e. the basic empty weight, the basic empty weight CG, and the configuration of the aircraft need to be identical to what we're modeling as close as possible. Then it's garbage in, no garbage out, good data in, good data out. So and so a lot of times that, but that's where we started. And then of course we started with using weight and balance is not rocket science once you understand the basic formulas, right? But one of the problems originally in X-Plane is the point of reference for CG was all derived from small aircraft models. And in the jet, they were using the nose of the aircraft, the tip of the nose of the aircraft, as the reference point. Well, that's not what Boeing uses. So the numbers were not going to align unless we made adjustments. We had to adjust for, where are we going to put the reference point in the flight model, and then use real weight and balance computations, and then test it. Now, how do you test it? Well, you can say, well, that looks about right. Well, this trim is right or this trim is wrong. Well, the problem is the trim authority correct or wrong, So it's not necessarily the point of reference. To be honest, what I used initially was to move the weight and balance center of gravity. This is going to sound strange, but this is what the kind of stuff you have to do in simulation sometimes, is I moved the center of gravity back to where it was right on top of the main gear.
Okay.
Right? And then push the throttle up for takeoff and see what happens. Right? If the nose comes off the ground, I know I'm very close to my CG point being accurate to the flight model.
Yeah.
If the nose didn't come off the ground, well, I'm still too far forward. If it went immediately on its tail and stayed there, well, you know what I mean? I want to get it so that I can pull the nose up, and it basically almost balances there. Now I know where my CG is. Now I can reverse engineer that back to find my point of reference, right, where I want to put it. So, you know, I mean, that's not something you do in a real airplane. But in a simulation, you know, we have to use some creative tools sometimes in order to reverse engineer the process. Always remembering that we're dealing with ones and zeros, right? We're not dealing with a real flight model. We're not dealing with real systems. We're dealing with, you know, a program. And a lot of times I think people lose track of that the laminar concept with X-Plane is the best one that has come along because I can use real flight dynamics characteristics, make modeling to address that, and it's predictable. Whereas it's not true in a lot of the competitor products out there. So it's, you know, because, you know, like I say, I'm not an engineer, and I'm not a the only reason why I have any clue what I'm doing at all is just from 40 years of experience in jets. That's it, you know, and an observation, you know. I did get some good training from the Air Force about 40 years ago when I spent 2 months in turbojet flight engineer school, where they put you through everything, especially performance. That was a big help to me because it taught me how to read any kind of a performance manual, especially the graphs and charts. Today, everything's mostly in table form, but back in the day, we had to work with segmented charts and things like that. And you had to know how to do that and be accurate with it in order to get good data out of them. So, but the bottom line is mostly it's by experience that I have learned because, you know, I get guys, you know, sometimes say, well, if you're an aerodynamic engineer, it must be right. No, well, not necessarily.
No.
You know, because they're theoretical. They're not practical in application. The only thing that matters to me is what are the results of flight tests. I don't care if the numbers match Boeing's numbers exactly. If it doesn't perform like Boeing's, then it's not right, and something needs to change. Just have to find out what that is. Right?
Yeah.
What is it? And in simulation, that may not be someplace where you thought you'd be looking for it. Obviously, as a pilot, I'm going to look for things that, you know, if I've got a problem with elevator authority, that's as a pilot, I can say, oh, well, I need to make the elevator stronger, or is my CG in the right place? Or, you know, there's things that I can correlate to that, but I still have to remember that I'm dealing with a simulation.
Exactly.
That there may be
the structure, the core, it was really different.
Exactly. There may be other things that don't seem to make sense, but are, you know, even just an equation that has an error in it somewhere in the simulation. And a good example of that is, for a very long time, Laminar had a problem with the basic flight model engine. All right, that was throwing us curveballs. And until they found that themselves, we had to work around deficiencies in the basic flight model, right? And then they even, to their credit, they came out and admitted it. I'm trying to remember the exact details of what it was now, but it was something that heavily affected our flight model. And, you know, and it was one of those cases where somebody had made a mistake in an equation that ended up in the programming, and it had to do with Mach drag, as I recall. But, you know, it was too steep of a Mach drag curve. It wasn't performing predictably. And yet we're out there flight modeling, trying to figure out how to build a flight model that responds correctly at various Mach numbers, at various altitudes, and it wasn't adding up, you know? So, and then to find out you were working with a flawed aerodynamic model, not the aerodynamic, but the flight physics, you know? So,
so you can hear, gents, what there is behind the Zibo, basically. How much work there is behind the Zibo. It's amazing. It's amazing. Wow.
You know, it for those who flew it from the beginning, you know, I can remember, you know, it was, and when I say this, I'll try to be gentle about this. It was there was a different, somebody else did the flight model originally for Zibo, and it, you know, nothing's perfect in the beginning, but as I recall, I didn't think at the time they were being very focused and responsive about developing the flight model, and so there were a lot of complaints about various, we'll just call it qualities in the flight model, and so that's kind of when I got involved in it, and I identified some problems I thought were possibly related to center of gravity. So I told Zibo I'd be glad to take a look at it, and if I could help, I would. So I played around and learned a little about the CG as it was modeled in X-Plane, and it became very evident very fast that the CG was too far aft, because what was happening is people were going to do a takeoff and the nose was coming up and the tail was going on the ground, right? Just sitting there. Well, that's pretty obvious to a pilot that that's CG related. Yeah. But so I moved the CG forward and to improve that flying quality. Zibo liked the results, so we started working on a few other things. One thing grew into another, and over about I can't remember exactly how long it is without going back in my records, but at one point he asked me if I could develop an entire flight model from scratch and how long it would take me to do that. And I wasn't absolutely certain, because I'm not a flight modeler by profession. You know, I mean, it was not something I had previously done a lot of, not at least not in X-Plane. So I said, well, I can probably do it for you, but I said, we'll just get a basic starter model that's flyable probably in about 2 weeks if I work on it hard every day. He says, well, let's give a shot at it. So ultimately what happened was, and like I say, you know, I don't want to come up with names, talk about names or anything, but the old flight model was discarded, and then we started a brand new one from scratch. And that began the march towards development that gave us the full freedom to do anything that we felt necessary to create the best flight dynamics for the Zibo mod. Whereas previously we were handicapped. If I made changes, I was stepping on somebody else's toes who was the author of the flight model. And, you know, and you know, Zibo wanted to do the best thing, so, you know, we ended up with this change. And I was happy to do it at the time. I had plenty of time to work on this stuff because I wasn't flying very much. And on my days off, when I was sitting in Shanghai in my hotel, or excuse me, my apartment, right, I could sit there and stare at the wall, or I could get my computer out and work on Zibo mod. You know, that was about it.
Fantastic.
But, so one thing leads to another, and I never thought we'd get to the point where we are now, and we're still not done. There's still things that we can do. But as you noticed, as I've been busy this last year or year and a half with my personal cockpit project, that you know, we haven't had to do that much. And the reason for that is we've gotten pretty dang close with the flight model already as it is.
Yeah.
You know, not mandating constant change. You know, we obviously went through that period where constant change was just the evolution of the flight model as we continued to flight test, identify problem areas, try to find solutions. Not all of those problems could be solved without doing what Zibo ultimately did, which is, you know, start external modeling, i.e., you know, building engines in C++, etc. It freed us from the limitations that still existed in the laminar engine model, amongst other things. You know, he's got almost all the Autoflight. I'm so amazed how fast he's developed the Autoflight.
Oh, it's crazy. It's the possibility to have the autopilot completely independent, and see also the FMA, one for the captain, one for the FO, and see the difference between them. this is giving you the possibility to really do the training on the Zibo, and so it's fantastic.
Well, he amazes me. You know, this change that we just made. If you've already read or just had any discussion about it, one of the things we were looking today, of course, was that we added the neutral elevator neutral shift, right? Like the real airplane has.
Yeah.
And that had been something I had been thinking about for a long time, but I knew I couldn't do it by myself because it was going to require Zibo to do the programming. And it's not it's a complex issue because it looks at so many different things, you know, the actual stabilizer setting being used, the center of gravity, with flaps, how much flaps. These are all variables that determined what the elevator neutral point shift should be. And doggone it, I bet you by the time him and I had a direct discussion with it yesterday or day before yesterday, whatever it was, I mean, he came back within an hour. He had a program, right, for us to polish. Just amazed me. And I went through and changed it and then looked at the data ref output, started changing stab trim settings and flap settings. His numbers were matching within 1/10 of a point of the actual aircraft graph from Boeing. And I went, I don't know how he does that, you know, because, you know, that obviously there's some skills there with developing the equations he needed to do the programming that are way beyond my scale. Now, the other thing that, of course, then I was discussing this with the guys earlier, that also meant once he put the neutral shift in there, that I also had to change the stabilizer airfoil model. I had to add more authority to it to offset the neutral shift. The whole goal of doing it was not just to have neutral shift, because the average simmer is not going to have a clue whether it's doing it or not. The whole goal was to solve this long-standing problem that some people have, not everybody has it, with more pitch force being required, i.e. how much stick travel does it take to rotate on takeoff for a given CG and weight and flap setting, or on landing, how much, you know, stick travel required to affect, you know, bringing the nose up for a proper pitch attitude on landing.
Yeah, I remember there was something, I'm talking now about 2 years ago. I don't know if you can remember, Nico, we did some tests and we changed a bit the fly model with landing between flaps 30 and flap 40. I don't know if you can remember, we did lots of tests. I remember one evening I did like something like 50 touch and go to test the difference between a flap 30 landing and a flap 40. Because there is a difference in the real aircraft.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that we did on this latest flight model update. And I'd be happy to get your feedback when you get a chance to evaluate it. If we need further tweaking, we will do that. Is we've known for a while when we did the XP12 model, right? We were not starting 100% from scratch, but we had to remodel a lot of the flight model because of the new laminar engine for flight dynamics. And one of the problems that arose is, you know, we got the flaps in the general vicinity. We got, you know, the amount of lift and the drag coefficients fairly close. But the problem with them not being right on is that at flaps 40, it was coming in maybe a 1 degree too low a pitch. And the same thing was true in flaps 30. It was not producing quite the correct pitch attitude.
Yeah.
You know, at ref and 5, for instance, right? So, or ref itself. So, I was tweaking on the flaps the other day to try and improve this. And this is really, really, it's a dicey area sometimes because I can make a change that would fix that. But if it's based on the wrong premise, maybe I damage the coefficient of lift, and now, you know, the actual performance of the aircraft with the flaps at various settings is not going to be right. So you have to find which, you know, what item you can change to actually improve that. There's all kinds of tool sets that I have, but if you don't pick the right one, then you affect other areas, and you end up having to come back and fix what you broke. So I made a small incremental change. When you evaluate it, you know, take a look at it. Flaps 30, flaps 40 approach, and, you know, give me your feedback. And based on that feedback, I'll come back and tweak it again. You know, I was looking for roughly with flaps 40 and ref and 5, I tried to tweak it to about 1 to 1.5 degrees nose up in the landing configuration. And for 30,
so 60 tons aircraft, 60 tons aircraft.
And I used a 60-ton aircraft to model it with. Yeah.
Yeah, 60 tons aircraft, flap 40 landing, 3 degrees glide. We're looking at about 0 to 0.5 nose up.
Okay.
No level flight.
I'm
talking about a 3 degrees glide. So it's not a level flight.
When you get a chance to fly it, and if you have the time to evaluate that, please do look at that and see how much you think it needs to change in one direction or another.
Okay.
Of course, I have the numbers out of the FCTM. The problem with the numbers out of the FCTM is most of them are based on the unreliable airspeed chart, and which uses ref and 10, right? So, when you model a ref and 10, that's fine. But if you're trying to get ref correct, that also is another issue that has to be addressed, because you're going to have a different lift coefficient, different drag profile, right, than just that 10 knots. So, you know, it's good to have, you know, somebody who's currently flying the airplane come back and say, okay, you know, add a 0.5 here, subtract 0.5, whatever. Then with that direct feedback, then I can more correctly update the model.
No problem.
Another thing that I do, and a lot of people are probably not aware of this, but you know, Boeing's not unique, right? They designed the airplane based on criteria in CFR 25, and I forget what they call it in the EASA, but they also use 25. It's a document that guides building the aircraft and how it should perform. And one of the things that they do with that is, so obviously you want a transport category jet to perform in a very predictable way. So one of the tests that I always do to make sure I've got everything still in the ballpark is I'll put it on autopilot and say at 5,000 feet, I'll slow to minimum maneuvering speed, right, at various weights. Use 60 tons for start, but I'll do it at real light weights and I'll do it at heavy weights, because that's going to tell me if I've got problems in my airfoil models, right, i.e. my angle of attack curve is correct. But, you know, what I do there is I slow it up to minimum maneuvering speed. There are minor differences, but almost every jet aircraft that I have flown in the transport category, minimum maneuvering speed in level flight, unaccelerated, is 5 degrees nose up. It varies by, a half a degree here, half a degree there, depending on configuration. But, actually Boeing, go ahead.
The Boeing aircraft, 60 tons aircraft, straight and level flight, 660, 6 degrees, 5.5 to 6 degrees nose up, and around 60% N1.
Yeah, and you're talking about minimum maneuvering speed, right? So at 60 tons, it's about 206, somewhere in there.
Yeah. Something like
anyway, at
level
that,
100.
And Boeing actually, they've got some charted information on this, but they don't chart all of the different flap settings, but they're all pretty close. So I look at that, and I also monitor the angle of attack, right? So that I'll slow it to the minimum maneuvering speed right? And I'm looking for that neighborhood. Now, to start with, I start out with that basic 5 degrees. Like you say, sometimes in some configurations as high as 6.
Yeah.
But generally it's between 5 and 6, right? Right in there. And then I'll put out flaps 1, right? And slow it to flaps 1 maneuvering speed. Well, flaps 1, it's almost no trailing edges that's doing much. It's all inboard leading edge flaps.
Yeah.
Right. And so you're going to get a different result, right? When you go to flaps 2 or flaps 5, you go to flaps 5, right? Now you're getting outboards and you should see changes. So I guess the bottom line is if the aircraft, if the wing model is pretty close to correct, its angle of resistance to the fuselage is pretty much correct, and the flaps lift and drag dynamics is all pretty close to correct, you're going to get predictable angles of attack, level flight, at min maneuvering speed, and they'll all end up right in that same neighborhood, plus or minus a half a degree.
Yeah, of course.
If they don't, you've got work to do. Something else is wrong,
Yeah.
But
yeah,
I also, the importance of it to me is that even if you don't have an angle of attack gauge in your airplane, right? When you're in straight and level flight unaccelerated, you can look at your deck angle and you know whether you're too fast or too slow, even if you don't have any speeds bugged. Right? If I see my nose above 5 degrees in any jet I've ever flown, I'm going to add some throttle and accelerate a little bit. And as you know, we can, within limits, we can maneuver these airplanes at min maneuvering speed. But typically, if I'm right at my min maneuvering speed, I need to limit my bank angle to 15 degrees. I can't go straight into a 30-degree bank, for instance. I shouldn't, because I'm gonna add acceleration forces, and you're gonna see if I had the angle of attack up, that my angle of attack is gonna go up to 6.5. Now I'm behind the lift over drag curve, and it can get into some problems. But it's so. What do? We usually min maneuvering plus 10 knots or something like that. And now, not only does the airplane fly in a safer regime, but the autopilot works better. If you're using the autopilot, it's gonna respond better because it's not at the edge of the envelope, so to speak. Trying to fly the airplane, on the head of a needle instead of, with over the curve, so to speak. So different airplanes have different margins that they add, but I found most of them, if you just accelerate 10 knots to maneuver the airplane above min maneuvering, that it's going to handle predictably. So, not being a 737 NG driver myself, I'm imparting some of this philosophy when I design the model. It's up to the guys that fly the airplane to give me the feedback, right, in order for me to further tune it, to that, like what we've just been talking about, right? These finer points. What's the final deck angle at flaps 40 on 5? What's the final minimum maneuvering deck angle? Those little things, and quite often, there's obviously a trust factor. If I'm dealing with somebody that I have not ever talked to before, or doesn't come recommended with credentials, then I have to take with some tongue-in-cheek, how do you call it? I don't always take everything to heart. Because as you know, sometimes the feedback isn't accurate, right? Or it's based on observations that may or may not take into account all the factors that you need to know. So I'm very selective about who I listen to. But when people come well recommended to me, like you, right, from Zibo, from Schematics, these guys, they know you, then I'm more likely to take to heart what you say. Especially when you can back it up with some obvious knowledge of the flight manual and the description of the engineering data.
And now the people here say that I can fly an airplane, but I just do cowboy style. So I don't know.
Yeah,
I
definitely wouldn't recommend him.
You see?
Yeah. Cowboy style is an inherent instinct, and it's developed from either good or bad technique, right? When I was flying the 727, I was a brand new first officer. The first line captain I was assigned to after I got off of initial line training was a fairly new captain.
Christopher Vetter donated $5
but
through Super
he
Chat.
was,
Thanks for hosting this.
for lack of a better word, he was definitely a cowboy, right? And he would one of our regular legs that we always flew was a leg from Denver to San Francisco. And we would come into San Francisco and he'd become barreling in, come downhill at right on the barber pole, which is 727. Likes to fly on the barber pole. It always did. But he'd come down on the barber pole and he'd hit 10,000 feet and he'd slow it to 250. And we'd be coming in to the final approach fix we used to do they called the bridge visual there. I don't know if they still have it there or not. But we would come in and you'd come across the bridge out on final for 28 right or 28 left. And, that was roughly equivalent to the outer marker or, final approach fix. And he'd come barreling in there at 250 knots. And I'm going, aren't you going to slow it down? And he says, yeah, no problem. I'll slow it down. I says, well, are we going to be stable? Now, this is back in the late 1980s, right?
Yeah, it's better now. Don't try these at home now.
We knew about a stabilized approach, but it wasn't a point of discussion of instruction yet, right? Because a lot of companies like a good example would be Southwest Airlines. They were famous for flying their unstabilized approaches to save money, which of course ultimately cost them a few accidents. But so he comes into the 727, he crosses the final approach fix at 250, and I'm going, Chris, I'm brand new, right? I'm the new kid on the block. Chris, are you going to slow down, man? He says, yeah. Out come the air brakes, down go the gear, flaps 1, flaps 2, flaps 5. Next thing I know, at 1,000 feet, we're right on ref, right on speed, right in configuration. In 500 feet, he did all of that. And I'm going, he says that's what this airplane was designed for.
Well, the guys here saw a bit of cowboy style with me on the Zibo, using the Zibo. And I was doing all sort of funny thing. Can't even remember. But mainly was circuit, like crazy. To test something maybe on final, to test a bit of handling as well. So I was doing quickly cowboy style to reposition myself. I don't know, on final, for instance.
In total control.
The thing I loved the most was the low pass, like at 10 feet of the runway with the gear up. That was something I loved to do.
But Sasso.
Anyway.
Sasso.
Yeah.
I still beat you with one maneuver. I've not seen you actually do this, and I've done it twice on stream live.
Which one?
The barrel roll in the Zibo.
Oh.
I've done that twice. Yeah, live on air. You need to show us if you can do that. I did it twice. At Porto, nonetheless. Porto.
At Porto.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Yeah.
Guys,
like,
this has been...
These at home.
This was an excellent stream. I don't know if you guys have checked the time, but we've been going for a considerable amount of time.
Yes. So, well, I'm looking to hear feedback, Sasso. So,
yeah, absolutely, Tim. Yeah, as soon as I get settled back and got my PC, get the X-Plane running and stuff, then we can organize and have feedback. Absolutely, no problem.
Yeah, there's no rush. It's just it's welcome, and of course, you could just drop a message in my inbox.
Absolutely,
in Discord, and because I'm pretty focused on other things too, and I've been kind of absentee lately when it comes to Zibo mod because of my, what am I doing? And I'm building a 737 NG, right? I mean, why not? So, I'm building a full simulator, and this is very time consuming. And and I want to be able to base it on Zibo Mod, and I want to be able to use it in tuning. So that's why I spent a lot of extra money just to have control loading like a real simulator, so
Really?
I can tune it. Yeah,
Wow.
If you go to FSC's website, you can see Flight Simulator Center.
Mhm.
That they do a lot of, and their stuff is expensive, but they're one of the few people who build components that are made for commercial use. So their stuff is all very sturdy, but they have control loading capable flight control systems, and so once I saw that, I was kind of hooked. But it's terribly expensive. I don't want to go into that right now, but had I not had a pilot's salary, I wouldn't have been able to afford it.
Yeah, I'll bet.
Now I don't. So anyway, but I've probably got another 4 or 5 months work on that if I stay concentrated on it. And it has taken me away from being deeply involved as I was before with the Zibo mod. But once that is basically done, that doesn't mean it won't distract me still, but I will have more time for fine-tuning, modeling, and being more involved in the community. And as I was telling the guys earlier, I've been threatening for a long time to do, some videos on, basic, just at least basic jet handling, so that the guys can learn how to hand fly the Zibo properly. Right?
I would agree with that.
Yeah, and it all, how it is, just starts with, start with the basics and work your way up. Everybody wants to learn how to do ILS approaches, right? And that's not what we want to be teaching, right? We want to be, teaching how to hand fly the airplane in the basic mode, and then build on that. And I think a lot of videos could be produced if it's done correctly and help simmers who don't otherwise have the option to go out and fly the real thing. Give them a way to get predictable results when they're hand flying, and outcome shall never be in doubt. So
definitely,
and that's
shared flight comes to mind as well.
Yeah. So anyway, the guys here all everybody does a great job of pointing out how to operate the systems and how to run the Autoflight, and this channel has been very useful in that way. But I think that there's another niche there, which is actual aircraft flight handling that is where I could, and I'm not the only one. You've taught, so you know what I'm talking about, or if you're teaching, there's certain things you can do to help people along. And since the Zibo mod now has the tools, we might as well start using them.
Definitely, yeah. No, I got your point. Yeah, it's all clear.
Yeah, I can't help but approach things from a pilot perspective always. I love simulation. I have since the very first one I saw, which was, Sublogic's flight simulator on an antique processor, right? Those things where it was amazing that they were modeling flight. And from that day, and I think that was like 1981 or something like that, the first time I saw it. Wow. From that time, I've been a sim enthusiast ever since then. But obviously things have changed a lot. I was just amazed the other day that how far we've come with the atmospheric modeling, with the tools to create the graphics, right? When I fly into an airport that I've flown into many times in real life, it may not be exactly correct to the real one, but it's so damn close that it gives you that feeling that you're there in that comfy zone of, recognizing where you're going because you've been there before.
Yeah.
And X-Plane is finally getting to that. I realize that a lot of people go to Microsoft Flight Simulator for that particular issue, but I have not bothered to myself. I just, because I more, X-Plane is more important to me, but just for my own reasons. But I was marveling at that. I just installed, what is the new visual, whatever the one for, for making the clouds and the atmosphere.
xEnviro.
Oh, not xEnviro, the other one. The new
Visual
one.
XP.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right. It's got problems still, but it does really do a good job. The only problem I have with it, of course, is it's still buggy. I'm still getting things like screen flashing and stuff like that occasionally. But just the basic X-Plane, when I fly that now, I'm surprised how well they've modeled the clouds finally. And I never have used ortho scenery. Maybe I will. The next thing is that maybe I'll try AutoOrtho out. One of the reasons I haven't done a lot of these is because I don't want anything to get in the way of the flight of X-Plane itself functioning correctly.
Yeah.
And I don't want to have to chase bugs that are created by any number of different add-on programs. So I try to keep the add-on programs to a minimum so that I'm looking at pure Zibo and pure X-Plane as much as possible. And there's nothing worse than having, some add-on program you've got creating issues in a place you wouldn't expect to find it, and you chase this bug forever when all you had to do was get rid of that add-on and the problem goes away.
Definitely, yeah.
So anyway, enough said about that. So in some ways, I'm a newbie. There's some of the guys here on the forum, for instance, that are way ahead of me because they're enjoying all of these great new tools that we've got in the sim that I haven't gotten around to using yet. So I don't even have better pushback because I don't need it for what I do, right? I usually want to get the airplane in flight as soon as possible so I can do some test flying. So anyway, how long did you say we've been online here?
4 hours. 4 hours now.
Okay.
Wow.
Well, then I should probably check out too. There's other things I need to be doing. And the last week here, I've been scratching my head, figuring out how I'm going to set up my my 3 projectors for my surround screen. And I've got to go buy some materials to build the framing for that, for my overhead. But 3 months ago, I bought, it's been almost 3 months, I guess. I bought these 4K projectors. They're just sitting in boxes on the floor. So, got to get that done.
We'll keep in touch then.
Yeah.
I will. We keep in touch. I will send you some feedback as soon as I manage to get the simulator running again.
All right. Good.
Excellent.
I'll be looking forward to it.
Okay. Tim, thank you for joining us. Sasso, you came at the right time. Thanks for joining us. Everybody else, thank you so much for listening and enjoying it with us. I'm pretty impressed. I must tell you one thing. The viewer count has gone up and down between like 41 and 25 roundabout, but I mean, it's fairly stable. So I'm fairly impressed. A lot of guys seem to have stayed much longer than usual. So thank you, guys. Thank you for that. Thank you, Christopher, for the donation. And that's it.
Well, I'm looking forward to feedback from anybody who has it. And I know I keep a low profile most of the time, but the forum here is obviously Discord is where it's all happening. So
yeah. Well, Tim, we still operate on the basis where the official support and stuff needs to go to the Explain Zibo forum. Okay, so for the guys that do have feedback, I think that is the best place. In Discord, it kind of gets buried far too fast, So get it on the forum, then Zibo and Twkster and myself and anybody else can see it. Okay, so that's the
it's much better.
Yeah,
and the best way for me, the best way, of course, for me, feedback on the forum is, of course, to tag me so that I get an email on it, and because I'm not on the forum all the time, but if something specifically tagged to me, then I'll go take a look at it.
Yeah. That tag is very important. Okay, cool. Thank you, guys.
All right.
We'll
All right,
probably
you guys
see
take
you
care.
tomorrow. Yeah, thanks, Tim. Zibo already fixed a couple of the bugs we picked up in my stream, so I'm not sure when the next fix will come out or the final version of 5.8 would come out. But I mean, he's been working while we've been talking, so just bear that in mind, and we'll keep you posted and stream the next one when it's due. Okay. That's it. Bye bye, everybody. We'll talk again.
Bye.
Thanks, guys. Cheers.
Bye.
Bye
Ciao.
now.